A cold wasn't just a cold when you lived in a medieval village, with no doctors nearby, no real medicine, and only smoky hearths, herbs, and whispered prayers. You didn't just suffer. You waited tonight. We lie quietly by the fire, tucked into scratchy blankets as we drift through what it truly meant to fall ill in a time when fever and fear shared the same bed. If softly told stories of forgotten struggles help your mind settle, you've come to the right place. Subscribe now and tap the bell icon for more sleepy, slow journeys through history's hardest days. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? It's always amazing to see how far our quiet, little stories are reaching. The frost had come early to Millbrook Village in the year of our Lord, 1347. And with it came the flux that would test every remedy Margot had learned in her 63 winters. Historic, she had been tending to the sick since her mother passed the knowledge to her some 40 years ago, her calloused hands mixing the same combinations of bishopwort, garlic, and wormwood that had served their community through countless seasons of illness. But this winter felt different. The sickness that had begun in the miller's cottage was spreading with a persistence that made her ancient joints ache with foreboding. You must understand that in a village of perhaps 200 souls, there was no physician, no hospital, learned doctor with his collection of leather-bound texts and silver instruments. Margot was what the villagers had always had, a wise woman whose knowledge had been passed down through generations of mothers and daughters, each adding their own hard-won understanding to the collection of remedies that kept their community alive. She delivered babies in the dark hours before dawn. She sat beside the dying in their final moments, and she ground herbs by candlelight while the rest of the village slept, preparing the tinctures and poultices that would see them through another day. The flux had begun simply enough. Young Willem, the miller's son, had complained of his belly griping after the harvest feast. His bowels had turned loose, and his mother, Beatrice, had brought him to Margot's cottage just as the first snow began to dust the thatched roofs of Millbrook. Margot had given him her usual remedy for such complaints, a mixture of ground oak bark and mint leaves steeped in ale, bitter but effective for most cases of loose bowels. She had seen this malady countless times before, particularly after feast days when stomachs unaccustomed to rich foods rebelled against the unusual bounty. But Willem did not improve. By the second day, his face had grown pale as old parchment, and his eyes had taken on that sunken look that Margot knew too well. The flux was not merely loose bowels. Now it had become the bloody flux, the dreaded dysentery that could drain the life from a person as surely as a punctured waterskin. Historic, the boy's waste had turned to liquid mixed with blood and mucus, and he could keep nothing in his stomach, not even the thinnest gruel or the mildest herb tea. Margot had seen dysentery before, of course. It came most often in the warm months when the streams ran low and the well water grew stagnant. But never had she seen it arrive with the first frost. She increased her remedies, grinding dried celandine and red nettle into a powder that she mixed with butter, creating a salve to rub on the boy's cramping belly. She prepared a tea from the precious store of wormwood she kept for the most serious cases, adding honey when she could spare it to make the bitter brew more palatable. But Willem grew weaker each day, his small body racked with fever and pain. On the fourth day, Beatrice came to Margot's door again, but this time she was not alone. Thomas the baker walked beside her, his usually ruddy face drawn with worry. His youngest daughter, little Margaret, had been seized by the same griping pains that had afflicted Willem. Within hours, she too was passing bloody flux and calling for her mother between fits of fever. By evening, 2 more families had come to Margot's door. The smith's wife complained of her husband's sudden weakness, and the widow Emma brought word that her elderly father could not leave his bed. Margot felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. In a village where most people never traveled more than 10 miles from their birthplace, where the knowledge of reading and writing was as rare as a perfect harvest, she was the repository of all their medical wisdom. The villagers looked to her not just for treatment, but for understanding. They needed her to explain why their children were suffering, why their elders were weakening, why the remedies that had always worked seemed powerless against this particular visitation of illness. She had learned long ago to read the signs that others missed. The way a fever patient's breathing changed just before the crisis. The particular odor that clung to those who would not recover. The telltale pallor that preceded death. But with each passing day, as more villagers fell ill, she began to suspect that this flux was unlike any she had treated before. It struck the strong as well as the weak, the young as well as the old. Even more troubling, it seemed to spread from house to house, despite her careful instruction to the families about boiling water and washing hands with the precious soap she made from ash and tallow. The village began to take on the hushed quality that accompanied serious illness. Conversations grew quieter, and people walked with a careful deliberation, as if sudden movements might invite the sickness into their own homes. Historic children were kept closer to their mothers, and the usual evening gatherings around the communal fire pit became sparse and subdued. The sound of coughing and retching began to punctuate the normal rhythm of village life. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the grinding of grain at the mill, the lowing of cattle being brought in for the night. Margot found herself walking from cottage to cottage more frequently than ever before. Her leather bag, worn smooth from decades of use, grew heavy with the glass vials and clay pots that contained her remedies. She carried dried herbs wrapped in scraps of cloth, each bundle carefully labeled with scratches that only she could read. There was elecampane for cough, meadowsweet for fever, and her precious store of mandragora root for those whose pain had become too great to bear. University of, but increasingly, she found herself reaching for the same combination of oak, bark, and mint, the remedy for flux that had served her mother and her mother's mother before her. As the weeks passed and winter settled in earnest over Millbrook, Margot began to notice patterns that troubled her deeply. The sickness seemed to follow certain paths through the village, jumping from household to household in ways that suggested something more than the usual spiritual or humoral explanations for disease. Historic, she had always believed, as she had been taught, that illness came from an imbalance of the body's four HUMORs: blood, phlegm, yellow, bile, and black bile. When these became unbalanced through poor diet, bad air, or spiritual transgression, sickness would follow. But this flux seemed to have a malevolent intelligence of its own, seeking out new victims with a persistence that defied her. Understanding, the turning point came on a particularly bitter morning in late November, when Margot woke to find that the sickness had reached her own doorstep. Her neighbor, old Harold, who helped her gather herbs in exchange for treatment of his arthritic joints, was calling weekly from his cottage. When she reached him, she found the telltale signs, the sunken eyes, the fever flush, the unmistakable odor of the bloody flux. Harold had been her companion in the work of healing for more than 20 years. The closest thing she had to an apprentice in a village where such knowledge was typically passed from mother to daughter. Standing in Harold's dim cottage, watching this man, who had been her partner in healing, writhe with the same pain she had been treating in others, Margot felt something she rarely allowed herself to experience: doubt. For 6 decades, she had been the village's source of certainty in the face of illness and death. Families brought their suffering to her because she could offer not just remedies, but the comfort of knowledge and experience. Parents desperate to save their children, spouses watching their loved ones slip away, elderly villagers facing their final illness, all had found in Margot's steady presence the reassurance that everything possible was being done, that someone understood what they were enduring. But as she prepared her familiar mixture of oak bark and mint for Harold, grinding the dried herbs with the same wooden pestle her mother had used. Margot found herself wondering if her remedies were truly helping, or if she was simply performing the ancient rituals that gave comfort to the suffering while the disease followed its own inexorable course. The flux had now claimed young Willem entirely. The boy had died 3 days earlier, his small body finally overcome by fever and dehydration. Margaret, the baker's daughter, lingered in a state between sleeping and waking, too weak to cry, though her parents maintained their vigil beside her bed. The question that haunted our Margot as she moved through the village that winter was one she had never dared voice aloud. What happened when the healer's knowledge proved insufficient? What happened when the remedies failed? When the ancient wisdom passed down through generations encountered something new and resistant to all the old ways of understanding? As she looked out at the snow-covered Stutskew, with Modio Sios, with Modio seemed lives a long-lasting color. When the ancient wisdom passed down through /lasad, when Stutz skewed up, my Movio pit, my / a lead, my wisto ries, it /lat, my lestide, by precate to side, you were on sa white, we salide, we are and I. By not ikatsid, ke you sound me they I we can you sakide sit, but it sis sakwispa I misa tistasik get to be a dips to resit to you did it to sit that to speak it to put sit sit they sit what's it's God cottages of Millbrook, each one harboring its own small tragedy. She wondered if she was witnessing not just another season of illness, but the beginning of something that would test everything she thought she knew about healing and death. By December, the flux had settled into Millbrook like an unwelcome guest who had no intention of leaving. Margot had ceased counting the days since Willem's death, focusing instead on the immediate demands of each dawn. Which cottage needed her? Attention first, which family had sent a child running through the snow to fetch her? Which of her dwindling supplies of herbs would be most needed as the day progressed? The rhythm of village life had reorganized itself around the sickness, creating new patterns of dependency and care that would have been unimaginable just months before. You could see the change most clearly in how the villagers moved through their daily tasks, or once neighbors had gathered freely to share news and gossip while drawing water from the well. Now they approached in careful succession, each family waiting for the previous group to finish before approaching. Historic, the knowledge that sickness could spread from person to person was not. New villagers had always been wary during times of plague and pox, but this flux seemed to require a different kind of caution. It lingered in households for weeks, claiming one family member after another with a methodical persistence that tested even the strongest family bonds. The Carpenter family had become Margot's most frequent destination. John Carpenter, whose strong hands had shaped the wooden supports for half the village buildings, now spent his days tending to his wife and 3 children, all of whom had succumbed to the flux within days of each other. Margot had watched this transformation with a particular sadness reserved for seeing the strong brought low. John had always been one of those men whose competence extended beyond his craft. He could set a broken bone, deliver a calf, and negotiate disputes between neighbors with equal skill. But illness had reduced him to a state of desperate dependence on remedies he didn't understand and a process of healing that seemed to follow no logic he could grasp. Each morning, Margot would find him sitting beside the bed where his family lay in various stages of recovery and decline. His wife, Catherine, had been the first to fall ill after helping to prepare Willem for burial, and she had been followed quickly by their youngest son, Peter, barely 7 years old. Their 2 older children, Mary and Robert, had shown remarkable resilience at first, continuing to help their father with the daily tasks of survival even as their mother grew weaker. But the flux had claimed them too, one by one, until John found himself the sole caregiver in a household where he had previously been the provider and protector. The challenge of caring for multiple family members suffering from dysentery was one that tested every practical skill a medieval villager possessed. Loomed the constant need for clean water, the endless washing of soiled linens, the preparation of special foods that might be tolerated by sensitive stomachs. All of this had to be managed while the caregiver himself remained strong enough to continue the work. John had learned to boil water as Margot had instructed, though he grumbled about the cost of fuel. He had mastered the preparation of the thin gruel that was often the only nourishment his family could keep down. He had even learned to recognize the subtle changes in fever and pain that might signal improvement or decline. But it was the emotional burden of watching his family suffer that seemed to wear on John most heavily. Medieval families, despite the popular notion of emotional distance necessitated by high mortality rates, were bound by deep affections and dependencies. Lumen, the loss of a child, was devastating, and the prospect of losing multiple family members created a kind of anticipatory grief that could be almost as debilitating as physical illness. Margot had seen this before, the way that fear and sorrow could weaken even the strongest person, making them more susceptible to whatever sickness was circulating through their community. The treatment of dysentery in medieval times required not just herbal remedies, but careful attention to what modern medicine would recognize as fluid replacement and electrolyte balance. University of Margot's approach involved a combination of astringent herbs to slow the flux, nutritive broths to replace what the body was losing, and careful observation to determine whether the patient was improving or declining. She prepared different remedies for different stages of the illness. Oak bark tea for the initial loose bowels. A more complex mixture including wormwood and celandine for the bloody flux. And finally, for those who seemed to be recovering, strengthening broths made from whatever meat or fowl the family could. The social dynamics of illness in a small village also created challenges that extended well beyond the medical. When John Carpenter became unable to work at his trade, the village lost not just his skills, but also the social connections that his workshop provided. His cottage had always been a gathering place where men would bring their tools for repair and linger to discuss the concerns of the day. With his family ill, and John focused entirely on caregiving, this social function disappeared, creating a kind of void in the village's communication network. Moreover, the economic impact of widespread illness was becoming apparent as winter deepened. Families that were struggling to care for sick members had less time and energy for the productive work that kept the village functioning. The baker's bread became less reliable as his attention was divided between his trade and his daughter's care. The smith's forge grew cold more often as he tended to his ailing wife. Even the mill, usually the most constant source of activity in the village, operated irregularly as the miller dealt with his grief over Willem's death and his wife's continuing illness. Margot found herself taking on responsibilities that went far beyond traditional healing. She became a coordinator of care, advising families on how to organize themselves when multiple members were ill. She taught older children how to prepare remedies for their parents, passing on knowledge that was typically reserved for adult women. She even found herself mediating disputes that arose when families under stress began to blame each other for the spread of disease or competed for her limited time and attention. The question of payment for her services also became more complex as the flux persisted. In normal times, Margot's healing work was compensated through an informal system of reciprocity. Families would pay her with food, cloth, help with heavy work, or promises of future assistance. But when entire families were struggling to meet their basic needs, this system began to break down. Some families offered payment they could not afford, driven by desperation to secure her help. Others simply could not pay at all, leaving Margot to decide whether her ethical obligations required her to provide care regardless of compensation. The spiritual dimension of illness also weighed heavily on the village during this period. Historic Father Benedict, the elderly priest who served Millbrook and 3 neighboring villages, had been visiting more frequently as the flux persisted, offering prayers for the sick and comfort for the grieving. But even his presence raised difficult questions. If illness was divine punishment for sin, as church teaching suggested, what collective transgression had brought this suffering to their community? If God's will determined who lived and died, what was the point of Margot's remedies and treatments? These theological complexities added another layer of confusion and guilt to families already struggling with practical challenges of care and survival. As Christmas approached, bringing with it the darkest days of the year, Margot began to notice subtle changes in the pattern of illness that gave her cause for both hope and concern. Some families, like the Carpenters, seemed to be slowly recovering, with the flux gradually loosening its grip on their household. Catherine had been able to keep down solid food for 3 consecutive days, and young Peter had shown enough improvement to complain about being confined to bed. But other households were experiencing a different trajectory. The smith's wife had developed a racking cough that seemed unrelated to the flux, and several of the elderly villagers were showing signs of the general weakness and decline that often preceded death in winter months. The intersection of malnutrition, cold weather, and disease created a particularly dangerous combination. Historic, even in good years, winter was a time of testing for medieval villages, when stored food supplies dwindled and the cold made every aspect of daily life more challenging. When you added the burden of serious illness to these seasonal stresses, the margin for survival became perilously thin. Margot had seen this pattern before. A village would weather one crisis successfully, only to be overwhelmed when a second challenge arrived before they had fully recovered from the first. As she made her rounds through the snow-covered village each morning, checking on her patients and adjusting their treatments based on the subtle signs of improvement or decline, Margot found herself thinking about the broader patterns of survival and mortality that shaped life in places like Millbrook. The flux had killed young Willem, but it had spared his father. It had devastated some families while leaving others untouched. It had tested the community's resources and resilience in ways that would have long-lasting effects even after the immediate crisis passed. But what troubled her most as December drew to a close was a growing suspicion that the flux itself was changing, adapting to the remedies she had been using against it. Some of her patients who had initially responded well to her treatments were experiencing relapses, their symptoms returning with renewed severity just when recovery had seemed certain. Others were developing complications that she had never seen before: the cough that had appeared in the smith's wife, a strange rash that had begun to appear on some of the children, a particular kind of weakness that seemed different from the ordinary debility that followed severe illness. These developments suggested that her understanding of this disease, built up over months of careful observation and treatment, might need to be revised yet again. The turning point came in early January, when the flux that had tormented Millbrook for 3 months began to reveal its true nature. Margot had risen before dawn, as was her custom, to check on her most critical patients before the day's demands overwhelmed her attention. The morning was bitter cold, with frost so thick on her cottage windows that she had to scrape it away with her fingernails to see outside. But as she prepared her daily round of remedies, grinding oak bark and steeping herbs in the pre-dawn darkness, she was interrupted by a pounding on her door that carried with it the unmistakable urgency of crisis. It was Thomas the baker, but he was barely recognizable. His face, usually flushed with the heat of his ovens, had taken on a grayish pallor that Margot associated with the most serious stages of illness. His hands shook as he gripped her doorframe, and when he tried to speak, his words came out in a rush of panic and desperation. His wife, Eleanor, had collapsed during the night. His daughter Margaret, who had seemed to be Recovering from her bout with the flux, had awakened with a fever so high that she was speaking in nonsense. But most terrifyingly, his two sons, who had remained healthy throughout the worst of the outbreak, had both fallen ill simultaneously. Their bodies racked with the familiar symptoms of dysentery, combined with something new and more virulent, as Margot followed Thomas through the pre-dawn streets. Her mind raced through the implications of what she was hearing. Historic. The flux had been cruel but predictable in its progression. It typically claimed the weakest first, moved through households in a pattern she could anticipate, and followed a course of illness that she understood. But this sudden explosion of severe symptoms in a family that had seemed to be recovering suggested something different. Either the disease was changing, or her understanding of it had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. The scene that greeted her in the baker's cottage confirmed her worst fears. Eleanor lay unconscious on the family's shared bed, her breathing shallow and irregular. Margaret, who had been sitting up and taking nourishment just days before, was now delirious with fever, calling out for people who had died years earlier. But it was the sight of the two boys that truly alarmed Margot. They lay side by side on pallets near the fire, their bodies contorted with pain, their eyes sunken so deeply that they seemed to have aged decades overnight. The flux was pouring from them with a violence she had rarely seen, and the smell in the cottage, the particular combination of fever, infection, and approaching death, told her that this family was facing something far worse than the ordinary. Progression of dysentery. What followed was the longest day of Margot's life as a healer. Working with a desperate intensity, she deployed every remedy she had ever learned, every technique her mother had taught her, every innovation she had developed. During her decades of practice, University of She prepared poultices for their burning skin, teas for their fever, and carefully measured doses of her precious mandragora root to ease their pain. She sent Thomas to other cottages to borrow supplies. She needed clean cloth for compresses, honey to sweeten bitter medicines, even a small amount of wine to strengthen a remedy that might give Eleanor the energy to fight. But as the hours passed, Margot began to realize that she was not treating the same flux that had afflicted Millbrook for the past months. This was something more virulent, more aggressive, and more resistant to the treatments that had at least provided some relief to earlier sufferers. The boy's fever climbed despite her cooling compresses. Eleanor's breathing grew more labored despite the expectorant herbs Margot administered. Margaret's delirium deepened until she no longer recognized her own father. By midday, Margot found herself preparing not for recovery, but for death. The speed with which the illness progressed forced her to confront questions she had been avoiding throughout the long months of the outbreak. Historic if her remedies had been truly effective against the earlier cases, why were they powerless now? If she had understood the nature of the flux, why had she failed to anticipate this sudden escalation? If her knowledge was reliable, why did she feel so helpless in the face of this family's suffering? These questions pressed against her consciousness with an insistence that was almost as overwhelming as the immediate demands of patient care. By evening, the crisis had deepened into tragedy. Young Robert, the baker's eldest son, died just as the sun was setting. His body finally overwhelmed by the combination of fever, dehydration, and the relentless assault of the flux. His death was followed within hours by that of his brother Michael, leaving Thomas to face the unimaginable loss of both his sons in a single day. Eleanor lingered through the night, her breathing growing ever more labored, until she too succumbed just before dawn. Only Margaret survived, though she remained delirious and desperately ill. The impact of this catastrophe on the village was immediate and profound. The baker's family had been central to Millbrook's daily life, providing not just bread, but also serving as a hub of information and social connection. Thomas's cottage had always been a place where villagers gathered to wait for their bread and share news. Eleanor had been known for her kindness to struggling families, often providing loaves to those who could not pay. The boys had been part of the village's next generation, expected to carry on their father's trade and contribute to the community's future. Their sudden deaths created not just personal grief, but a kind of collective shock that reverberated through every household. More troubling still was what their deaths suggested about the nature of the illness itself. If the flux could suddenly become more deadly, if it could overwhelm even those who seemed to be recovering, then every family in Millbrook was potentially at risk. The careful patterns of care and precaution that had developed over the previous months suddenly seemed inadequate. Parents who had felt cautiously optimistic about their children's recovery now watched them with renewed anxiety. Households that had escaped the worst of the outbreak began to wonder if their turn was yet to come. For Margot, the failure to save the baker's family represented more than professional disappointment. It challenged the very foundation of her identity and purpose. University of for more than 40 years, she had been the person villagers turned to when illness threatened their families. Her knowledge had been their shield against disease and death, her remedies their hope for healing and recovery. But, standing in Thomas's cottage, surrounded by the bodies of those she had been unable to save, she felt the weight of her limitations with a clarity that was almost crushing. The theological implications were equally troubling. If illness was divine punishment, as Father Benedict insisted, then what sin had brought such devastating judgment upon the baker's family? Historic Thomas was known for his honesty and generosity. Eleanor had been praised for her charitable spirit. The boys had been ordinary children, no better or worse than their peers. If God's justice had determined their fate, then no one in the village could feel safe. But if illness was not divine punishment, if it followed patterns that had nothing to do with moral worth or spiritual condition, then what did that say about the religious framework that gave meaning to their lives? As January continued and the immediate shock of the baker's tragedy began to settle into a more permanent grief, Margot found herself facing a crisis of understanding that went far beyond the medical. Historic the remedies she had learned from her mother, the wisdom that had been passed down through generations of village healers, the careful observations she had accumulated through decades of practice, all of it seemed suddenly insufficient in the face of what she had witnessed. The flux had revealed itself to be not just another seasonal illness, but something more complex and unpredictable than her traditional framework could accommodate yet, even as doubt gnawed at her confidence. Margot continued her daily rounds through the village. Margaret, the baker's surviving daughter, required constant care as she slowly emerged from her delirium. Other families still depended on her treatments and advice. The practical demands of healing work continued even as her understanding of that work underwent fundamental revision. In the early weeks of February, as winter began its slow retreat, and the flux finally started to loosen its grip on Millbrook, she found herself rebuilding her approach to healing from the ground up. The lessons she drew from that devastating winter would stay with her for the rest of her life. She learned that diseases could change and adapt in ways that made traditional remedies less effective. She discovered that the boundary between success and failure in healing was often thinner than she had imagined. She came to understand that even the most experienced healer would sometimes face illnesses that exceeded their knowledge and skills. But perhaps most importantly, she realized that the value of her work lay not just in the remedies she provided, but in the comfort and hope she offered to families facing the ultimate uncertainty of illness and death. As spring arrived and the last cases of the flux finally resolved, Millbrook began the slow process of recovery and rebuilding. The village had lost 11 souls to the outbreak, not as many as some communities suffered during times of plague, but enough to leave lasting scars in the social fabric of daily life. Luman Thomas, the baker, eventually remarried and had other children, but he never spoke easily of That terrible January night when he lost his sons. The miller and his wife gradually returned to health, though Beatrice would suffer recurring bouts of weakness for years to come. Other families found their own ways to heal and move forward, carrying with them the knowledge that survival was never guaranteed and that even the most ordinary season could bring extraordinary challenges. For Margot, the flux of 1347 became a turning point that shaped her understanding of healing for the remainder of her years as the village wise woman. She continued to use the traditional remedies that had served her community for generations. But she approached them with a humility and flexibility that had been tested by failure and refined by hard experience. She learned to say, "I don't know," when faced with unfamiliar symptoms. And she began to experiment more freely with new combinations of herbs and treatments. Most importantly, she came to understand that the true measure of a healer was not the ability to cure every illness, but the willingness to stand with families in their suffering and to offer whatever comfort and hope was possible in the face of life's fundamental uncertainties. The rains began in the spring of 1315 and continued with a relentless persistence that marked the beginning of what would later be remembered as the Great Famine, though the carpenter family of Ashworth Village could not have imagined, as they watched their planted fields turn to muddy lakes, that they were witnessing the opening act of a catastrophe that would reshape medieval Europe. Historic Robert Carpenter, his calloused hands still bearing the scars from 40 years of working wood and stone, stood in the doorway of his cottage that May morning, watching the rain fall with an intensity that seemed to mock the careful rhythms of agricultural life that had sustained his family for generations. You must understand that for a medieval peasant family, the failure of crops meant something far more immediate and desperate than the inconvenience of high prices at market. Luman the carpenters, like most villagers, lived within a narrow margin of subsistence, storing just enough grain from each harvest to carry them through to the next growing season. Their survival depended on a delicate balance between production and consumption, between the calories they could grow or earn, and the energy they needed to sustain life and work. When that balance was disrupted, whether by crop failure, illness, or economic upheaval, families could find themselves facing starvation with a speed that would have seemed impossible to those who had never experienced true scarcity. Robert's wife, Alice, stood beside him watching the water pool in what should have been their barley field, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. She was carrying their fourth child, due to arrive as summer turned to autumn, and already she could feel the peculiar weakness that comes when a growing baby draws nutrients from a body that has less to give with each passing day. Luman, their existing children, Mary, aged 12, Thomas, 10, and little Catherine, barely 6, clustered around their parents' legs, sensing the adult anxiety even if they couldn't fully comprehend its implications. The children had never known true hunger, had never experienced the particular kind of fear that comes when parents begin to ration food not just for economy, but for survival. The relationship between malnutrition and disease in medieval times created a vicious cycle that could destroy communities with devastating efficiency. Historic as food became scarce and families were forced to subsist on smaller portions of increasingly poor quality nutrition, their body's ability to fight off infection diminished dramatically. At the same time, the stress of hunger and the consumption of contaminated or spoiled food made people more susceptible to the very illnesses they were least equipped to survive. What began as a simple agricultural crisis could quickly evolve into a complex medical emergency that tested every resource a community possessed. The first signs of the hunger sickness appeared in Ashworth Village as early as midsummer, when the failed spring planting became undeniable and families began to stretch their remaining stores of grain with increasingly desperate measures. Alice Carpenter found herself grinding acorns to mix with their dwindling flour, a practice she remembered her grandmother describing from her own childhood but had never expected to employ herself. The bitter taste of acorn bread was distinctive and unpleasant. But more troubling was the way it seemed to pass through the body, without providing the sustained energy that proper grain offered. The children complained of feeling hungry even after eating, and Alice herself noticed that she tired more easily than she had during her previous pregnancies. The symptoms of chronic malnutrition developed slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. Historic Thomas, the 10-year-old son, was the first to show obvious signs. His usual boundless energy began to flag, and he complained more frequently of being tired. His mother noticed that his arms and legs seemed thinner than they should be for a boy his age, and his clothes began to hang loosely on his frame. Mary, despite being older and stronger, developed a persistent cough that seemed to linger week after week, without quite developing into a serious illness. Little Catherine became increasingly clingy and irritable, crying over minor frustrations that would normally have been brushed aside with the resilience of childhood. But it was the adult members of the family who faced the most complex challenges as the hunger, sickness took hold. Robert found that his work as a carpenter required an energy expenditure that his reduced diet could not sustain. The physical demands of his trade, lifting heavy timbers, wielding tools for hours at a time, maintaining the precision required for quality work, all became more difficult as his body began to consume its own muscle mass to compensate for inadequate nutrition. Worse still, his reputation as a skilled craftsman depended on his ability to complete projects quickly and accurately, but hunger affected his concentration and judgment in ways that threatened his livelihood just when his family needed income most desperately. Alice faced the particular challenges of pregnancy during famine conditions. The developing child in her womb continued to draw nutrients from her body regardless of what she ate, creating a biological competition between mother and child that could prove fatal to both. Lumen medieval understanding of pregnancy was limited, but women had learned through generations of experience that expectant mothers needed additional food and rest to ensure healthy births. When those needs could not be met, the consequences were often devastating. Alice began to experience the peculiar combination of symptoms that marked nutritional deficiency in pregnancy: persistent fatigue, dizziness, and a kind of bone-deep weakness that made even simple tasks feel overwhelming. The social dynamics of famine created additional pressures that compounded the medical challenges facing families like the carpenters. As food became scarce throughout the village, the informal networks of mutual aid that normally helped families through temporary difficulties began to break down. Neighbors who might ordinarily have shared surplus food or offered help with childcare were struggling with their own survival. The bonds of community that had sustained Ashworth through previous crises were tested by the competing demands of family loyalty and neighborly obligation. When everyone was hungry, the moral imperative to help others became a luxury that few could afford. The relationship between hunger and illness became more apparent as autumn approached, and the failed harvest confirmed what everyone already knew: there would be no grain to carry them through the winter. The carpenter children began to suffer from the common afflictions that accompanied chronic malnutrition. Thomas developed a persistent stomach ailment that left him doubled over with pain after eating even small amounts of food. Mary's cough worsened and was joined by a general listlessness that made it difficult for her to help with household tasks. Catherine began to suffer from what her parents recognized as the early signs of the wasting disease that could claim malnourished children with frightening speed. The medical understanding of malnutrition in medieval times was limited by the theoretical framework of humoral medicine, which attributed illness to imbalances in the bodies for humors rather than to specific nutritional deficiencies. When families sought help from local healers, they were often prescribed treatments that addressed the symptoms of hunger, sickness, without understanding its underlying cause. Bloodletting, the most common medical intervention, was particularly dangerous for people who were already weakened by inadequate nutrition. Herbal remedies, while sometimes helpful, could not address the fundamental problem of insufficient calories and nutrients. Alice's pregnancy progressed through the autumn months under increasingly difficult circumstances. The child in her womb continued to grow, but she could feel that something was not quite right. Her previous pregnancies had been characterized by robust health and steady weight gain, but this time she seemed to be losing weight even as her belly expanded. The baby's movements felt weaker and less frequent than she remembered from carrying her other children. Most troubling of all, she began to experience the kind of persistent fatigue that she associated with serious illness rather than the normal tiredness of pregnancy. The approach of winter brought with it the certainty that conditions would only worsen. Historic, the carpenter, family stores of food carefully rationed throughout the summer and autumn would not last through the cold months ahead. Robert's work as a carpenter had provided some additional income, but the demand for his services had decreased as other families faced their own economic crises. The construction and repair projects that normally sustained his family through the winter had been postponed or canceled as people focused their resources on obtaining food rather than improving their homes. As the first snows began to fall, Alice went into labor 3 weeks earlier than expected. The birth took place in the family's one-room cottage, with Mary serving as her mother's primary helper and Robert pacing anxiously outside the door. Lumen, the midwife, an elderly woman named Joan, who had delivered most of the children in Ashworth over the past 30 years, arrived just as Alice's labor pains became intense. But even Joan's experienced hands could not compensate for the effects of months of malnutrition on both mother and child. The baby, a son they named Edmund, was born alive but dangerously small and weak. He weighed less than any of Alice's previous children, and his cries were thin and feeble. Joan, examining the infant with the practiced eye of someone who had seen hundreds of births, shook her head grimly. She had delivered many babies during times of hardship, and she recognized the signs of what she called hunger birth, children whose development had been compromised by their mother's inadequate nutrition. Such babies could survive, but they required constant care and attention that was difficult to provide when the entire family was struggling with malnutrition. Alice's recovery from childbirth was complicated by her weakened condition and the demands of nursing a fragile infant. Lumen medieval women faced significant risks during and after birth under the best of circumstances, with maternal mortality rates that claimed approximately 20% of mothers. When those risks were compounded by malnutrition and the stress of famine conditions, the dangers multiplied dramatically. Alice found herself struggling to produce adequate milk for Edmund while simultaneously trying to maintain her strength for caring for her other children and managing the household. During the crisis, the winter of 1315-1316 tested the Carpenter family's resilience in ways that would have been unimaginable just a year earlier. Historic. The hunger sickness that had begun with simple food shortages had evolved into a complex medical crisis that threatened every member of the family in different ways. Thomas's stomach ailments had worsened to the point where he could keep down only the thinnest gruels, and his body had become so thin that his ribs showed clearly through his skin. Mary's cough had developed into a more serious respiratory condition that left her breathless after even mild exertion. Catherine, despite her parents' best efforts to ensure she received adequate nutrition, had begun to show the telltale signs of the wasting disease that claimed so many malnourished children. But perhaps the most ominous development was the way that malnutrition was beginning to affect the family's ability to fight off other illnesses. Historic, the hunger sickness had weakened their immune systems at precisely the time when the crowded, unsanitary conditions of winter made them most vulnerable to infection. As December deepened into January, and the family's food stores dwindled to nothing, Robert and Alice found themselves facing not just the prospect of starvation, but the growing certainty that their weakened bodies would be unable to resist. whatever diseases might strike their community during the long, cold months ahead. By February of 1316, the hunger sickness that had begun as a simple matter of insufficient food had transformed into something far more complex and threatening. The Carpenter family's cottage, once a place of warmth and security, had become a careful battleground where every calorie was precious and every symptom of illness carried the potential for disaster. Alice, still recovering from Edmund's difficult birth, found herself managing not just her own failing health, but the increasingly desperate needs of 4 children, whose bodies were consuming themselves in the absence of adequate nutrition. The daily rhythm of survival had reorganized itself around the relentless demands of hunger. Historic Alice would wake before dawn, not to the luxury of planning a day's activities, but to the immediate necessity of deciding how to divide their remaining food among 6 people who were all desperately hungry. The mathematics of starvation were cruel and precise. A handful of grain that might sustain an adult for a day would be insufficient for a nursing mother, but might keep 2 children alive for another 24 hours. These calculations, made in the gray light of winter mornings, tested every maternal instinct and challenged every assumption about family, hierarchy, and care. Edmund, now 3 months old, had become the family's most vulnerable member and their greatest source of anxiety. Lumen Alice's milk production had dwindled to almost nothing as her body, starved of the nutrients needed to sustain lactation, began to shut down non-essential functions. The baby's cries had grown weaker and more infrequent, a development that Joan the midwife had warned was more ominous than the loud protests of a healthy infant. Medieval mothers learned to read the subtle signs of their children's condition with an accuracy born of necessity. And Alice could see in Edmund's sunken eyes and listless movements the approach of the final stages of malnutrition. The older children were fighting their own battles against the hunger sickness. Thomas, at 10, had developed the particularly heartbreaking symptom of what medieval healers called the wolf hunger, a condition where the stomach, empty for so long, began to cause constant, gnawing pain that made it difficult to sleep or concentrate. University of his thin frame had taken on the appearance of premature aging, his face gaunt and his movements careful and deliberate in the way of elderly people conserving their strength. Mary, despite her 12 years, had become a second mother to Catherine, taking on responsibilities that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances but which had become essential to the family's survival. Catherine, at 6, was perhaps the most tragic victim of the family's circumstances. Lumen children of her age were particularly vulnerable to the effects of malnutrition as they're growing. Bodies required proportionally more nutrition than adults. She had stopped growing entirely, her clothes hanging loose on a frame that seemed to be shrinking rather than developing. More troubling still, she had begun to exhibit the behavioral changes that accompanied severe malnutrition, periods of unusual listlessness, alternating with bursts of irritability that seemed to come from nowhere, and could not be comforted by the usual parental reassurances. Robert's situation was perhaps the most complex of all the family members, as he struggled to maintain his role as provider while his own body succumbed to the effects of chronic hunger. His work as a carpenter had become increasingly difficult as malnutrition affected his strength, coordination, and judgment. The precise work of measuring and cutting would require steady hands and clear thinking. But hunger had made him shaky and prone to mistakes that could ruin expensive materials. Worse still, his reputation as a skilled craftsman was beginning to suffer just when the family most needed whatever income his work could provide. The relationship between hunger and disease became more apparent as winter deepened, and the family's resistance to infection continued to decline. Historic Thomas's persistent stomach ailments had evolved into a condition that modern medicine would recognize as severe gastritis, caused by the combination of inadequate nutrition and the consumption of foods that his digestive system could no longer process effectively. Mary's respiratory problems had worsened to the point where she struggled to breathe normally, a condition that was likely related to the weakening of her immune system and the damp cold. Conditions in their cottage. The social dynamics of famine also created medical challenges that went beyond simple malnutrition. As food became scarce throughout Ashworth Village, desperate families began to consume foods that would normally have been considered inedible or dangerous. Alice found herself feeding her children bread made from bark and acorns, supplemented with whatever roots and plants she could find buried beneath the snow. These foods, while providing some calories, often caused digestive problems and sometimes contained toxins that could make an already weakened person seriously ill. The psychological effects of chronic hunger were as debilitating as the physical symptoms. Historic, the constant preoccupation with food, the persistent anxiety about survival, and the gradual breakdown of normal social relationships all contributed to a kind of mental exhaustion that made it difficult to think clearly or make good decisions. Alice found herself obsessing over every morsel of food, calculating and recalculating how to divide their meager supplies. Robert became increasingly irritable and withdrawn, his usual patience with the children's needs replaced by a desperate focus on finding work that might bring in enough money to buy food. The medical understanding of malnutrition in medieval times was inadequate to address the complex health problems that famine created. University of Wen families sought help from local healers. They were often prescribed treatments that addressed individual symptoms without understanding the underlying cause. Alice took Thomas to see Brother Francis, a monk from the nearby monastery who had some knowledge of herbal remedies, but his treatments focused on balancing the boy's humors rather than addressing his nutritional needs. The herbs he prescribed, while well-intentioned, could not provide the calories and nutrients that Thomas's body desperately required. The approach of spring brought both hope and new dangers. Historic, the prospect of a new growing season offered the possibility of eventual relief from the famine, but the family's condition had deteriorated to the point where they might not survive long enough to benefit from any improvement in food supplies. Edmund had become so weak that he barely responded to stimulation, and Alice feared that her milk had dried up entirely. Thomas's stomach ailments had worsened too, the point where he could not keep down even the thinnest gruel, and his body had begun to show the telltale signs of the final stages of starvation. The crisis came in early March, when Catherine developed a fever that quickly escalated into a pea cheese, and Elise escalated into a pea, and a la list Harley scave, and his my la sis on the mise of pea, and his body had begun with C's. As we saw, May said it balished, we saw it as it cases cave, we saw it my C's, casely plot, by Saweze a kide, ka wisit, like, be wid tad, with a kate, with a canoe gonna lally sev to be Cyresa api, it's a Greek kayak list, it's to be to cledit, it's it per it is a good it is to put us, it's a cullet, with it gets done to the eat the distance. That's serious illness. Historic, her weakened immune system, compromised by months of malnutrition, was unable to fight off what might have been a minor infection under normal circumstances. Within days, she was delirious and struggling to breathe, her small body racked with chills and fever. Desperate to save her youngest daughter, sought help from every source she could find, the village wise woman, Brother Francis, even the priest who normally confined his healing efforts to spiritual matters. But Catherine's illness highlighted the cruel reality of medical care during famine conditions. University of the treatments that might have helped her required ingredients that were either unavailable or too expensive for a family that had already spent their last resources on food. The strengthening broths that could have supported her recovery required meat or fowl that the carpenters could not afford. The warming spices that might have helped her fever required money that Robert could not earn in his weakened condition. Even the simple act of keeping her warm required fuel for fires that the family could not afford to maintain. The turning point came when Lise made a decision that would haunt her for years to come. Lumen, faced with the choice between feeding her older children or maintaining her own strength to care for Edmund, she chose to give her remaining food to Thomas, Mary, and Catherine. Her reasoning was practical rather than sentimental. The older children had a better chance of survival if they could maintain their strength, while Edmund's prospects seemed increasingly dim regardless of what she did. But the decision required her to accept the likelihood that she would not survive to see the spring planting, and that her infant son would die within days of her own death. The consequences of Alice's sacrifice became apparent within a week. Lumen, her body, already weakened by childbirth and months of malnutrition, began to shut down rapidly once she stopped eating entirely. She developed a persistent cough that suggested the onset of pneumonia, a condition that was often fatal even for healthy adults. Her thinking became confused and disoriented, and she began to lose the ability to care for Edmund or to help with the other children's needs. Robert, faced with the prospect of losing his wife and managing 4 children while suffering from his own malnutrition, found himself overwhelmed by responsibilities that exceeded his physical and emotional capacity. The final weeks of winter brought a series of crises that tested the family's ability to survive intact. Historic Catherine's fever broke after a week of desperate illness, but she emerged from the crisis so weakened that she could barely sit up without assistance. Thomas's stomach ailments had progressed to the point where he was vomiting blood, symptom that medieval healers recognized as a sign of approaching death. Mary, despite her efforts to care for her siblings, had developed a persistent weakness that made it difficult for her to help with even basic household tasks. Edmund continued to fade, his cries growing weaker each day as his small body consumed itself in the absence of adequate nutrition. But perhaps the most devastating development was Alice's gradual decline into the final stages of starvation. Lumen, the woman who had been the family's source of strength and organization, who had managed their resources and cared for their needs throughout the crisis, was now barely conscious most of the time. Her breathing had become labored and irregular, and her body temperature had dropped to the point where she needed constant warming to prevent hypothermia. Robert, watching his wife slip away while surrounded by his starving children, faced the terrible realization that his family might not survive the winter intact. The question that haunted Robert during those final weeks of winter was whether his family's suffering served any larger purpose, or whether they were simply the victims of circumstances beyond their control or understanding. Historic, the hunger sickness had revealed the fragility of the assumptions that had governed their lives, the belief that hard work would be rewarded with security, that family bonds would provide protection against disaster, that the knowledge and skills passed down through generations would be sufficient to ensure survival. As March turned toward April and the first signs of spring appeared in the fields around Ashworth, Robert found himself wondering whether those who survived the Great Famine would be fundamentally changed by the experience, and whether the lessons learned during that terrible winter would prove to be worth the cost of learning them. The spring of 1316 arrived with a cruel irony that would mark the final chapter of the Carpenter family's struggle against the hunger sickness. As the snow melted and the first green shoots appeared in the fields around Ashworth Village, Alice Carpenter drew her last breath on a morning when the sun was finally warm enough to penetrate the thick walls of their cottage. Lumen, she had held on through the darkest months of winter, sustained by maternal determination and the terrible mathematics of survival. But her body's resources had been exhausted beyond recovery. Her death came quietly, without the dramatic struggle that often accompanied the final stages of starvation, as if she had simply run out of the energy needed to continue breathing. Robert found himself alone with 4 children, whose survival now depended entirely on his ability to navigate the complex transition from famine to recovery. Edmund, now 6 months old, had somehow survived the worst of the winter despite weighing less than most infants half his age. His survival was a testament to Alice's sacrifice, but it also presented Robert with the immediate challenge of finding a wet nurse in a community where most women were themselves malnourished and struggling to feed their own children. The baby's condition was so precarious that even a few days without adequate nutrition could prove fatal. Yet Robert had neither the resources to pay for nursing nor the social connections that might have provided such care as an act of charity. The older children faced their own battles with the long-term effects of severe malnutrition. Historic Thomas, at 10, had survived the winter, but emerged from it fundamentally changed. His stomach ailments had evolved into a chronic condition that made it difficult for him to digest even simple foods, and his growth had been stunted in ways that would affect him for the rest of his life. Mary, despite her efforts to care for her siblings, had developed a persistent weakness that limited her ability to help with household tasks. Catherine, though she had survived her fever, remained fragile and prone to illness in ways that suggested her immune system had been permanently compromised by months of malnutrition. The social dynamics of recovery from famine created challenges that were as complex as those of survival. During the crisis itself, as spring arrived and the prospect of a new harvest offered hope for the future, the village of Ashworth began to reorganize itself around the new realities created by the Great Famine. Some families had survived relatively intact, while others had been devastated by death and disability. The informal networks of mutual aid that had sustained the community through previous crises needed to be rebuilt. But the process was complicated by the fact that everyone was still struggling with the aftermath of their own losses and challenges. Robert's situation was particularly precarious because his role as a provider had been undermined by his own health problems and the changed economic conditions in the village. The months of malnutrition had affected his strength and coordination to the point where his carpentry work was no longer of the quality that had previously earned him a reliable income. At the same time, the demand for his services had decreased as families throughout the village focused their resources on immediate survival rather than home improvements or new construction. The skills that had once provided security for his family now seemed inadequate to meet their needs. In the post-famine world, the medical challenges facing the surviving members of the Axley carpenter family were complicated by the limited understanding of nutrition and recovery that characterized medieval medicine. University of Brother Francis, the monk who had tried to help Thomas during the worst of the winter, understood that the boy's stomach ailments were related to his prolonged hunger. But his treatments focused on balancing humors rather than addressing the underlying nutritional deficiencies. The herbs and remedies he prescribed, while well-intentioned, could not repair the damage that months of starvation had inflicted on Thomas's digestive system. Similarly, the treatments available for Mary's weakness and Catherine's recurring illnesses addressed symptoms rather than causes, providing temporary relief, but no long-term solution. The question of Edmund's survival became the most pressing immediate concern as Robert struggled to find adequate care for his infant son. Lumen, the baby's condition, was so fragile that he needed constant attention and specialized feeding that Robert could not provide while also caring for his other children and trying to restore his ability to work. The search for a wet nurse led him to Margaret, a young woman from a neighboring village whose own infant had died during the winter. She was willing to take Edmund into her household, ma'am, but her own health had been compromised by months of malnutrition, and her ability to produce adequate milk was uncertain. The arrangement that Robert eventually negotiated with Margaret highlighted the complex social and economic relationships that famine created. Unable to pay for Edmund's care with money he didn't have, Robert agreed to work for Margaret's family during the spring planting season, providing labor that would help them recover from their own losses. The agreement was mutually beneficial, but it also meant that Robert would be separated from his son during the critical months when Edmund's survival was most uncertain. The decision required him to balance his infant's immediate needs against his other children's long-term welfare. A calculation that captured the cruel mathematics of survival. In post-famine communities, the spring planting season of 1316 brought both hope and new challenges for families. Throughout Ashworth Village, historic, the fields that had been underwater during the previous year's failed harvest were finally dry. Enough to plant, but many families lacked the seed grain necessary to take advantage of the improved conditions. The Great Famine had forced people to consume not just their food stores, but also the grain that should have been reserved for planting, creating a shortage that would affect agricultural production for years to come. Robert found himself working Margaret's fields with borrowed tools and donated seed, part of a community-wide effort to restore agricultural productivity despite the reduced resources available. The physical demands of agricultural labor proved challenging for people who were still recovering from the effects of prolonged malnutrition. Historic Robert discovered that his strength and endurance had been permanently affected by the months of hunger, and tasks that had once been routine now left him exhausted and shaky. The other men working alongside him faced similar challenges, creating a situation where the spring planting proceeded more slowly and less efficiently than in normal years. The reduced productivity meant that even under ideal conditions, the coming harvest would be smaller than usual, extending the period of scarcity and making full recovery from the famine more difficult. The children's adjustment to life without their mother revealed the long-term psychological effects of surviving such an extreme crisis. Lumen Mary, at 12, had assumed many of Alice's responsibilities, but she was still a child herself and struggled with the emotional burden of caring for her siblings while grieving for her mother. Thomas's stomach ailments were accompanied by periods of deep sadness and withdrawal. That suggested the trauma of the winter had affected his mental as well as physical health. Catherine, despite her young age, seemed to understand that their family had been fundamentally changed by their experiences, and she clung to Mary and Robert with a desperation that spoke to her fear of further loss. The summer of 1316 brought a successful harvest that marked the beginning of the end of the Great Famine. But the Carpenter family's recovery was complicated by the lasting effects of their ordeal. Historic Edmund, now over a year old, had survived his dangerous infancy, but remained small and weak compared to children his age. Margaret's care had been adequate to keep him alive, but the months of inadequate nutrition during his earliest development had left him with health problems that would affect him throughout his life. Thomas's digestive problems had improved with better nutrition, but he continued to suffer from periodic episodes of stomach pain that limited his ability to work. Mary and Catherine had both grown stronger during the summer months, but their development had been stunted in ways that would have lasting consequences. Robert's efforts to rebuild his carpentry business met with mixed success, as the village economy gradually recovered from the famine. Some families had emerged from the crisis with resources intact and were ready to invest in home improvements and new construction, but others remained too impoverished to afford anything. Beyond basic necessities, Robert's skills were still valuable, but his physical limitations meant that he could no longer take on the most demanding projects, and his income remained lower than it had been before the famine. The family standard of living had been permanently reduced, and they would need to adapt to a more precarious existence than they had known before the crisis. The social fabric of Ashworth Village had also been permanently altered by the experience of the Great Famine. Historic, the crisis had revealed both the best and worst of human nature, creating new bonds of mutual support between some families while destroying old relationships that could not withstand the pressures of extreme scarcity. The informal networks of reciprocity that had sustained the community through previous difficulties had been tested to their breaking point, and the process of rebuilding them required careful navigation of grudges and obligations that had accumulated during the worst months of the famine. As autumn approached and the successful harvest promised an end to the immediate threat of starvation, Robert found himself reflecting on the lessons that his family's ordeal had taught him about the relationship between health, survival, and community. Historic the hunger sickness had revealed the fragility of the assumptions that had governed their lives before the crisis. The belief that hard work would be rewarded with security, that family bonds would provide protection against disaster, that the accumulated wisdom of generations would be sufficient to ensure survival. The famine had stripped away these comfortable illusions and forced him to confront the harsh reality that survival often depended on factors beyond individual control or merit. The long-term health consequences of the Great Famine would affect the Carpenter family for years to come, creating vulnerabilities that would make them more susceptible to future crises. Luman Edmonds' early malnutrition had affected his physical and cognitive development in ways that would limit his opportunities throughout his life. Thomas's digestive problems would require careful attention to his diet and would affect his ability to work in physically demanding occupations. Mary and Catherine, despite their apparent recovery, would carry with them increased susceptibility to illness and a lifetime of memories that would shape their understanding of security and risk. But perhaps the most profound impact of the hunger sickness was the way it had changed the family's relationship with their community and their understanding of their place in the world. The experience of watching Alice sacrifice herself for her children's survival, of seeing neighbors turn away from families in need, of discovering that traditional remedies were powerless against the effects of starvation. All of these revelations had fundamentally altered Robert's worldview. He had learned that the medieval village, despite its appearance of stability and continuity, was actually a fragile construction that could be destroyed by forces beyond human control or prediction. As winter approached, once again, bringing with it memories of the previous year's suffering, the Carpenter family faced the future with a mixture of gratitude for their survival and anxiety about their continued vulnerability. They had learned that recovery from extreme malnutrition was a slow and uncertain process, that the effects of starvation could persist long after adequate food became available again. They had discovered that survival was not simply a matter of individual strength or virtue, but depended on complex networks of social support that could be strained or broken by crisis. Most importantly, they had come to understand that the hunger sickness was not just a medical condition, but a fundamental challenge to the assumptions and institutions that gave meaning to medieval life. Agnes the midwife had delivered more than 300 babies during her 37 years of service to the villages around Thornfield. But as she climbed the narrow stairs to Margaret Blackwood's birthing chamber on a gray October morning in 1348, she carried with her the accumulated weight of knowledge that would be tested by circumstances more desperate than any she had previously encountered. Luman the Black Death had arrived in their region just 2 months earlier, and already the familiar rhythms of life and death had been disrupted by the presence of a disease that killed with a speed and thoroughness that challenged every assumption about survival and divine providence that had sustained these communities for TOs for PM's Court. Ruby Kiss, only Ruby Kiss. Only Ruby Kiss has the luxurious texture. Mom says, TOs ACF, Life's Generations. You must understand that childbirth in medieval times was already a perilous undertaking that claimed the lives of approximately 1 in 5 mothers. Even under the best of circumstances, Luman, the process of bringing new life into the world, required a complex coordination of physical strength, medical knowledge, and social support that could be disrupted by any number of factors. When those normal risks were compounded by the presence of plague in the community, the birthing chamber became a place where the boundaries between life and death were even thinner than usual, where every decision carried consequences that could extend far beyond the immediate participants in the drama of birth. Margaret Blackwood was 23 years old and pregnant with her second child, having lost her first baby to fever when he was barely 6 months old. Historic, her husband, William, was a prosperous wool merchant whose trade had brought them into contact with travelers from plague-stricken regions. And Margaret herself had begun to show the early symptoms of the disease just as her labor pains commenced. The combination of childbirth and plague created a medical crisis that tested the limits of medieval healing knowledge and forced Agnes to make decisions based on experience and instinct rather than established procedures. The birthing chamber itself was a small, windowless room. On the upper floor of the Blackwood house, carefully prepared according to traditions that had been passed down through generations of midwives and mothers. University of the walls were hung with blessed cloths and protective charms, and the floor was strewn with herbs that were believed to ease labor pains and protect against evil influences. A large wooden bed dominated the space, surrounded by the tools of Agnes's trade, clean linens, sharp knives for cutting the birth cord, bowls for collecting blood and other fluids, and various herbal preparations that could be used to strengthen a laboring mother or ease her pain. But the normal comfort and security of the birthing chamber had been compromised by the knowledge that plague was present in the household. Historic Margaret's symptoms, fever, weakness, and the telltale swellings in her neck and armpits that marked the bubonic form of the disease had appeared just days before her labor began. The timing created a terrible dilemma for Agnes, who knew that attending a plague victim put her own life at risk, but who also understood that Margaret and her unborn child would almost certainly die without skilled assistance during the birth. The social dynamics of plague created additional complications that extended beyond the immediate medical challenges. Historic William Blackwood, despite his wealth and social position, found himself isolated by fear as neighbors and servants fled his household to avoid infection. The women who would normally have assisted Agnes during the birth, Margaret's mother, her sister, her female friends, and neighbors had all refused to enter the house once Margaret's illness became apparent. Even the priest, Father Thomas, had hesitated to provide the spiritual comfort that was considered essential during childbirth, though he had eventually agreed to remain nearby in case last rites became necessary. Agnes approached this birth with the accumulated wisdom of nearly 4 decades of experience, but also with the humility that came from understanding how little was truly known about the process of bringing life into the world. University of Medieval Medical Knowledge about childbirth was a mixture of practical observation, religious belief, and folk wisdom that had been refined through generations of trial and error. Midwives learned their craft through apprenticeship and experience rather than formal education, and their treatments were based on an understanding of the body that emphasized the balance of humors and the influence of spiritual forces rather than the mechanical processes that modern medicine would recognize. The relationship between midwife and laboring mother was one of the most intimate and consequential in medieval society, requiring a level of trust and cooperation that could mean the difference between life and death for both mother and child. Agnes had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated whether a birth was proceeding normally or developing complications that might require intervention. She could assess the strength of labor pains, the position of the baby in the womb, and the mother's physical and emotional condition, with an accuracy that was essential to making the moment-by-moment decisions that determined the outcome of difficult births. Margaret's labor had begun during the night, with the irregular pains and restlessness that typically marked the early stages of the process. But Agnes could see immediately that this birth would be complicated by factors that went far beyond the normal challenges of childbirth. Historic Margaret's fever was high enough to cause delirium, and her plague symptoms were progressing with the rapid deterioration that characterized the most severe cases of the disease. The swellings in her neck and armpits had grown larger and more painful, and her breathing had become labored in a way that suggested the infection was affecting her lungs as well as her lymphatic system. The intersection of plague and pregnancy created medical challenges that had no precedent in Agnes's experience or in the traditional knowledge that guided medieval midwifery. University. Of the herbs and remedies that she normally used to strengthen laboring mothers and ease their pain might be inappropriate or even dangerous for someone suffering from plague. The physical positioning and breathing techniques that facilitated normal births might be impossible for a woman whose disease was affecting her respiratory system. Even the basic procedures for maintaining cleanliness and preventing infection took on new significance when the birthing chamber was already contaminated by plague. As Margaret's labor progressed through the morning hours, Agnes found herself constantly adjusting her approach based on the changing balance between the demands of childbirth and the progression of plague symptoms. Historic, when Margaret's fever climbed too high, Agnes focused on cooling remedies and techniques to bring down her temperature. When the labor pains seemed to weaken due to Margaret's declining strength, Agnes administered strengthening herbs and encouraged her to drink broths that might sustain her energy. When Margaret's breathing became too labored to allow effective pushing, Agnes adjusted her position and provided respiratory support that might allow the birth to continue. The emotional and spiritual dimensions of childbirth during plague times added another layer of complexity to Agnes's responsibilities. Historic medieval women approached childbirth with the understanding that they might not survive the experience, and they typically prepared for the possibility of death by making arrangements for their children and seeking spiritual comfort from religious authorities. Margaret's situation was even more precarious because her plague symptoms made death seem not just possible but likely, regardless of the outcome of her labor. Agnes found herself serving not just as a medical attendant but as a spiritual counselor, helping Margaret prepare for whatever outcome awaited her. The question of what to do if Margaret died during labor created practical and ethical dilemmas that tested the limits of medieval medical knowledge and social custom. University of if the mother died before the baby was born, there were surgical procedures that could potentially save the child's life, but they required skills and tools that were not typically available to midwives. If both mother and child died, their bodies would need to be prepared for burial in ways that minimized the risk of spreading plague to others. If Margaret survived but the baby died, she would need care and support during her recovery that might be difficult to provide in a plague-stricken household. As the day wore on and Margaret's condition continued to deteriorate, Agnes began to realize that she was witnessing not just a difficult birth, but a convergence of circumstances that would test everything she thought she knew about healing, death, and the mysterious processes that determined who lived and who died. Historic, the birthing chamber, which had always been a place where life and death met in the most fundamental way, had become an arena where individual medical crisis intersected with community-wide catastrophe, where personal tragedy was magnified by the larger drama of plague that was reshaping their entire world. The afternoon brought new complications as Margaret's labor intensified, but her strength continued to decline. Lumen the baby was positioned correctly and seemed to be developing normally, but Margaret's body was struggling to complete the birth process while simultaneously fighting off the effects of plague. Agnes found herself making moment-by-moment decisions about whether to intervene more aggressively or to allow the natural process to continue, knowing that either choice carried risks that could prove fatal for both mother and child. The isolation of the birthing chamber, normally a source of privacy and security for laboring mothers, had become a prison that cut Agnes and Margaret off from the support and assistance that they desperately needed. The fear of contagion had driven away the network of women who would typically have provided help, advice, and comfort during a difficult birth. Even William, despite his love for his wife, was afraid to enter the room where she labored, leaving Agnes to face the crisis alone with only her experience and intuition to guide her decisions as evening approached and the birthing chamber filled with the gray shadows of approaching night. Agnes prepared herself for what might be the most challenging test of her career as a midwife. Margaret's condition had reached a critical point where the next few hours would determine not just the outcome of her labor, but whether she would survive to see her child or join the growing number of plague victims who had died in the villages around Thornfield. The question that haunted Agnes as she prepared for the long night ahead was whether her skills as a healer would prove sufficient in the face of forces that seemed to dwarf human knowledge and intervention. The night hours in Margaret Blackwood's birthing chamber stretched with the peculiar elasticity that time acquires. During medical crises, each moment weighted with consequences that could determine the survival of two lives hanging in the balance between birth and death. Historic Agnes had positioned herself beside the bed where Margaret labored, her experienced hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had guided hundreds of women through the dangerous passage of childbirth. But her mind was racing through calculations and possibilities that had no precedent in her decades of experience. As a midwife, Margaret's condition had deteriorated as the plague symptoms progressed alongside her labor pains, creating a medical crisis that required Agnes to constantly reassess her priorities and methods. University of the fever that accompanied. Margaret's bubonic plague had climbed to dangerous levels, causing periods of delirium where she seemed unaware of her surroundings or the progress of her labor. The swellings in her neck and armpits had grown larger and more painful, making it difficult for her to find comfortable positions for birthing. Most troubling of all, her breathing had become increasingly labored, suggesting that the infection was spreading to her lungs and creating the pneumonic form of plague that killed, even more quickly than the bubonic variety. The traditional remedies that Agnes normally employed to ease labor pains and strengthen laboring mothers required careful modification when applied to a woman suffering from plague. University of the herbs that would typically be used to reduce fever might interfere with the natural process of labor, while the strengthening broths that could sustain a woman's energy during prolonged to-seat births might not be tolerated by someone whose digestive system was compromised by disease. Agnes found herself improvising treatments based on her understanding of both conditions, creating combinations of remedies that had never been tested under such extreme circumstances. The physical challenges of managing Margaret's birth were compounded by the emotional and psychological strain of working in isolation from the support network that normally sustained midwives during difficult cases. In ordinary circumstances, Agnes would have been assisted by experienced women who could help with the practical tasks of birth attendance, while also providing emotional support and advice based on their own experiences. The presence of other women in the birthing chamber served not just practical purposes, but also created a sense of shared responsibility and communal support that made the lonely work of midwifery more bearable. But the fear of plague contagion had stripped away these normal sources of assistance, leaving Agnes to manage every aspect of Margaret's care single-handedly. Historic, she needed to monitor Margaret's vital signs, adjust her position to facilitate the birth, prepare and administer medications, maintain the cleanliness of the birthing chamber, and provide the emotional support that could make the difference between a mother's will to live and her surrender to despair. The physical demands of these tasks, combined with the mental strain of making life and death decisions without consultation or support, tested Agnes's endurance in ways that went far beyond the normal challenges of her profession. The progression of Margaret's labor followed a pattern that was both familiar and unprecedented in Agnes's experience. University of the basic mechanics of birth proceeded according to the natural rhythms that Agnes had observed countless times before: the gradual opening of the birth canal, the baby's movement through the stages of descent, the increasing intensity of contractions as the body prepared for delivery. But these normal processes were complicated by Margaret's declining strength and the way her plague symptoms interfered with her ability to participate actively in the birth process. During Margaret's periods of fever-induced delirium, Agnes found herself essentially managing the birth alone, using her hands to guide the baby's passage, while Margaret remained only semi-conscious and unable to push effectively. Historic, when Margaret's breathing became too labored to allow coordinated pushing, Agnes had to find ways to support the natural expulsive forces of labor without overexerting a woman whose respiratory system was already compromised by disease. These moments required a level of skill and intuition that went beyond anything Agnes had learned during her training or developed through her years of practice. The question of timing became crucial as the night progressed and Agnes began to realize that Margaret's survival might depend on completing the birth before the plague symptoms overwhelmed her completely. Historic medieval midwifery generally favored allowing labor to proceed at its natural pace, intervening only when clear complications developed that threatened mother or child. But Margaret's case presented a situation where the normal timeline of birth might exceed her body's ability to sustain both the demands of labor and the assault of plague infection. Agnes found herself weighing the risks of intervention against the dangers of delay. Knowing that either choice could prove fatal, the emotional burden of caring for Margaret extended beyond the immediate medical challenges to encompass the broader tragedy of a young woman facing death at the moment when she should have been celebrating new life. Margaret's first pregnancy had ended in the loss of her baby to fever, and she had approached this second pregnancy with the mixture of hope and anxiety that characterized women who had experienced infant mortality. The addition of plague to her birthing experience transformed what should have been a joyful culmination of pregnancy into a desperate struggle for survival that tested her physical and spiritual resources to their limits. Agnes had learned during her years as a midwife that the psychological state of a laboring woman could significantly affect the physical progress of birth. And she understood that maintaining Margaret's hope and determination was as important as managing her medical symptoms. During Margaret's lucid moments, Agnes talked to her about the baby they were working to deliver, describing the signs that suggested the child was healthy and strong. She shared encouraging stories from her own experience, reminding Margaret of other women who had overcome difficult births to hold their children safely. She provided the kind of emotional support that family members would normally have offered, becoming not just a medical attendant, but a source of human connection during Margaret's darkest hours. The spiritual dimensions of Margaret's situation added another layer of complexity to Agnes's responsibilities. Historic medieval women approached childbirth with the understanding that they were participating in a process that was fundamentally beyond human control, dependent on divine will and supernatural forces that could not be influenced by medical intervention alone. The rituals and prayers that normally accompanied birth were intended to invoke divine protection and ensure safe delivery. But Margaret's plague symptoms raised questions about whether her illness was itself a form of divine judgment that might affect the outcome of her labor. Father Thomas, who had agreed to remain in the Blackwood house during Margaret's labor, spent the night hours in prayer in the room below the birthing chamber, ready to provide last rites if Margaret's condition deteriorated beyond hope of recovery. His presence provided some comfort to both Margaret and Agnes, but it also served as a constant reminder of the gravity of their situation, the normal celebration and anticipation that accompanied birth had been replaced by a vigil that resembled a death watch, where the focus had shifted from welcoming new life to preventing the loss of existing life. As dawn approached, Margaret's labor reached the critical phase where the baby's head began to crown, marking the beginning of the final stage of delivery. Agnes could see that the infant appeared to be healthy and of normal size, but Margaret's strength had declined to the point where she might not be able to complete the pushing that would bring her child into the world. The combination of fever, exhaustion, and respiratory distress had left Margaret barely conscious and unable to coordinate her efforts with the natural rhythm of her contractions. Agnes faced a critical decision about whether to intervene more aggressively to complete the delivery or to continue supporting the natural process despite the risks of delay. University of Medieval Midwifery included techniques for assisting difficult births, including the use of manual pressure and positioning to help guide the baby's passage. But these interventions carried their own risks and were typically reserved for situations where the alternative was certain: death for mother or child. Margaret's case seemed to meet those criteria, but Agnes was working without the consultation and support that would normally inform such a momentous decision. The moment of choice came as the sun rose over Thornfield Village, casting pale morning light through the small window of the birthing chamber. Historic Margaret's breathing had become so labored that Agnes feared she might lose consciousness entirely before the birth could be completed. The baby's head was visible but not progressing, caught in a position that required active maternal effort to complete the delivery. Agnes realized that she would need to take a more active role in guiding the birth, using her hands and experience to compensate for Margaret's declining ability to participate in the process. What followed was the most technically demanding work of Agnes's career as a midwife, requiring her to use every skill she had learned while simultaneously improvising techniques that had never been taught or practiced under such extreme circumstances. University of working with infinite care to avoid injuring either mother or child, she guided the baby's passage through the final stages of birth, supporting Margaret's efforts when she had strength to push and compensating for her weakness when the plague symptoms overwhelmed her ability to participate actively in the delivery. The baby emerged just as the morning bells of Thornfield were ringing the hour of prime, a healthy girl whose first cries filled the birthing chamber with a sound that seemed miraculous after the long night of struggle and uncertainty. Lumen Agnes worked quickly to clear the infant's airways and ensure her breathing was strong and regular, then turned her attention to Margaret, who had collapsed into unconsciousness immediately after the birth, but whose breathing seemed slightly easier without the additional burden of supporting the baby's needs. The successful delivery of a healthy child represented a victory that was both personal and symbolic in the context of the plague-stricken community. Historic, at a time when death seemed to dominate every aspect of life, when families were being destroyed by disease, and communities were being torn apart by fear, the arrival of new life offered a reminder that the basic processes of human continuity could persist even under the most challenging circumstances. But Margaret's survival remained uncertain, and the question of whether she would live to raise her daughter created a different kind of suspense that would determine the ultimate meaning of the night's events. The hours following the birth of Margaret Blackwood's daughter revealed the cruel complexity of survival during plague times, where the successful completion of one life-threatening crisis could immediately give way to new challenges that tested the limits of medieval medicine and human endurance. Historic Agnes found herself caring for a newborn who appeared healthy and strong while simultaneously tending to a new mother, whose plague symptoms continued to progress despite the successful delivery. The birthing chamber, which had been a battleground during the night, now became an intensive care ward where every decision could determine whether Margaret would live to know her daughter. Margaret's condition in the immediate aftermath of birth presented Agnes with medical challenges that had no clear precedent in her experience or training. University of the physical trauma of labor and delivery, which normally required days or weeks of recovery, even for healthy women, was compounded by the ongoing assault of plague infection on Margaret's already weakened body. Her fever remained dangerously high. The swellings in her lymph nodes continued to grow larger and more painful, and her breathing had become so labored that Agnes feared the infection was spreading to her lungs with potentially fatal consequences. The question of whether Margaret would be able to nurse her newborn daughter created immediate practical problems that extended beyond medical concerns to encompass the basic survival of both mother and child. Lumen medieval infants who could not be breastfed by their mother's face dramatically reduced chances of survival, as alternative feeding methods were unreliable and often led to malnutrition or infection. Margaret's plague symptoms made it uncertain whether she could produce adequate milk, and the risk of transmitting disease to her baby through nursing created additional complications that Agnes had never been forced to consider. Agnes made the difficult decision to attempt to establish nursing despite the risks, reasoning that the baby's immediate nutritional needs outweighed the uncertain dangers of plague transmission through breast milk. University of working with infinite care to position Margaret comfortably despite her fever and pain. Agnes helped guide the baby to her mother's breast and was relieved to discover that Margaret's milk production had begun normally, despite her illness. The sight of the healthy infant nursing successfully provided a moment of hope and normalcy that seemed almost miraculous in the context of the larger tragedy surrounding the birth. But Margaret's ability to care for her daughter remained severely limited by her continuing illness, creating a situation where Agnes found herself serving not just as a midwife, but as a surrogate mother for a newborn whose biological mother was fighting for her own survival. The practical demands of infant care, feeding, cleaning, monitoring for signs of illness or distress, required constant attention that Margaret could not provide in her weakened condition. Agnes took on these responsibilities while simultaneously continuing to treat Margaret's plague symptoms and monitor her recovery from childbirth. The isolation that had characterized Margaret's labor continued during her recovery, as fear of plague contagion kept away the female relatives and neighbors who would normally have provided support during the vulnerable weeks following birth. The absence of this traditional support network meant that Agnes became responsible for tasks that would typically have been shared among several women: preparing special foods for the nursing mother, maintaining the cleanliness of the recovery chamber, providing emotional support during the difficult adjustment to motherhood, and serving as an experienced guide through the challenges of early infant care. William Blackwood's response to his daughter's birth was complicated by his fear of plague infection and his grief over his wife's condition. Despite his joy at becoming a father again, he remained reluctant to enter the birthing chamber where Margaret lay, afraid that close contact might expose him to the disease that was threatening her life. His absence deprived Margaret of the emotional support that husbands typically provided during recovery from childbirth, and it left Agnes to serve as the sole adult companion for a woman who needed both medical care and human connection during her struggle to survive. The progression of Margaret's plague symptoms during the days following the birth created a medical crisis that tested the limits of Agnes's knowledge and skills. University of the bubonic swellings that had appeared during her labor continued to grow and become more painful, and new symptoms emerged that suggested the infection was spreading throughout her body. She developed a severe cough that produced blood-tinged sputum, indicating that the plague had likely reached her lungs. Her fever climbed to levels that caused prolonged periods of delirium, during which she seemed unaware of her newborn daughter. Agnes's treatment of Margaret's condition required her to balance the competing demands of plague care and postpartum recovery, two medical challenges that had never been combined in her previous experience. University of the herbs and remedies that might help reduce Margaret's fever and ease her breathing could potentially interfere with her body's recovery from childbirth. The strengthening foods and tonics that would normally be prescribed for new mothers might not be tolerated by someone whose digestive system was compromised by disease. Agnes found herself improvising treatments that attempted to address both conditions simultaneously, creating combinations of remedies that had never been tested. Under such circumstances, the question of what would happen to Margaret's daughter if her mother died became increasingly urgent as Margaret's condition deteriorated during the second week after the birth. Lumen medieval infant mortality rates were high even under the best circumstances, and babies who lost their mothers in the early weeks of life faced particularly poor prospects for survival. The search for a wet nurse who would be willing to take responsibility for a potentially plague-exposed infant proved difficult, as most women were reluctant to risk their own health and that of their families by accepting such a dangerous charge. Agnes found herself not only providing medical care, but also serving as an advocate. for the baby's future welfare, using her connections within the community to identify potential sources of care if Margaret did not survive. Her reputation as a skilled and trustworthy midwife gave her influence that she could use on behalf of her patients, but the pervasive fear of plague made even her recommendations less persuasive than they would have been under normal circumstances. The crisis forced her to confront the harsh reality that medical skill alone was insufficient to ensure her patients' welfare when social and economic factors created barriers to care and support. The turning point in Margaret's illness came during the 3rd week after her daughter's birth, when the progression of her plague symptoms reached a critical phase that would determine whether she would recover or succumb to the infection. The bubonic swellings that had grown steadily larger and more painful suddenly began to change in character, becoming softer and showing signs that they might rupture and drain. Agnes recognized this development as a potentially positive sign, as medieval medical understanding suggested that the discharge of infected material from plague buboes could sometimes lead to recovery, rather than death, working with careful attention to cleanliness and infection control. Agnes prepared to manage the drainage of Margaret's buboes, using techniques that she had learned from other healers but had never had occasion to employ. University of the process was painful and dangerous, requiring her to lance the swellings and ensure adequate drainage while minimizing the risk of further infection. Margaret, weakened by weeks of illness, could barely tolerate the procedures, but Agnes understood that successful drainage might represent her patient's best chance for survival. The drainage of Margaret's buboes was followed by a gradual improvement in her other symptoms that suggested her body was beginning to win its battle against the plague infection. Her fever began to subside for longer periods, allowing her to remain conscious and aware of her surroundings for the first time since the early stages of her labor. Her breathing became easier as the infection in her lungs began to clear, and she was able to take nourishment that would help restore her strength. Most importantly, for both her immediate survival and her long-term recovery, she was able to resume nursing her daughter with growing consistency and confidence. The process of Margaret's recovery revealed the complex relationship between maternal and infant health in medieval times, where the survival of one often depended directly on the welfare of the other. As Margaret's strength returned and her ability to nurse improved, her daughter began to thrive in ways that had seemed impossible during the darkest days of the crisis. The baby, who had been named Eleanor after Margaret's mother, grew visibly stronger and more alert as her mother's milk production increased and became more reliable. The sight of a healthy mother nursing a thriving infant provided a powerful symbol of life's persistence even in the face of the most devastating challenges. Agnes's role during Margaret's recovery expanded beyond medical care to encompass the broader work of helping a family reconstruct their lives after surviving a crisis that had threatened to destroy them entirely. William Blackwood, who had remained isolated from his wife and daughter during the worst of Margaret's illness, gradually began to participate in their care as the risk of contagion diminished. His tentative re-entry into the birthing chamber, where he saw his daughter for the first time without the shadow of imminent death hanging over the scene, marked the beginning of his family's emotional recovery from the trauma they had endured. The successful outcome of Margaret's birth and recovery became a source of hope and inspiration for other families in Thornfield, who were struggling with their own experiences of plague and loss. Historic Agnes found that her reputation as the midwife who had delivered a healthy baby from a plague-stricken mother brought her new respect and increased demand for her services. But it also carried with it the burden of expectations that might be impossible to meet in future cases. The community's need for hope and positive examples of survival created pressure on Agnes to achieve similar outcomes in situations where success might be far less likely. The long-term implications of Eleanor's birth during plague times would affect her throughout her life. marking her as someone who had survived extraordinary circumstances from her very first moments of existence. Lumen medieval communities often viewed children who had been born during times of crisis or who had survived devastating illnesses as being specially blessed or protected by divine providence. Eleanor's survival of her mother's plague infection, combined with her healthy development despite the dangerous circumstances of her birth, would likely give her a special status within her community that could provide both advantages and burdens as she grew to adulthood. For Agnes, Margaret's case represented a transformation in her understanding of her role as a midwife and healer that would influence her practice for the remainder of her career. University of the experience of managing childbirth complicated by plague had forced her to develop new skills and approaches that went far beyond traditional midwifery, requiring her to become an expert in crisis management, family counseling, and community health in ways that no formal training could have prepared her for. She had learned that healing often required more than medical knowledge, demanding courage, creativity, and the ability to provide hope in the face of seemingly impossible circumstances. The social and economic impact of the plague on communities, like Thornfield, created new challenges and opportunities for medical practitioners, like Agnes, that would reshape their roles in fundamental ways. Historic, the high mortality rates among physicians and other learned healers during plague epidemics often left communities dependent on traditional healers, midwives, and wise women whose knowledge was based on practical experience rather than formal education. Agnes found that her successful management of Margaret's case had elevated her status within the community and brought her responsibilities that extended far beyond traditional midwifery to encompass general medical care for families affected by plague. As autumn turned to winter and the plague epidemic in Thornfield began to subside, Agnes reflected on the lessons that Margaret's case had taught her about the relationship between individual healing and community survival. Historic, the successful birth of Eleanor had provided more than just the preservation of 2 lives. It had offered proof that the basic processes of human reproduction and family formation could continue even under the most challenging circumstances. The sight of a healthy mother nursing her thriving infant had reminded the community that life persisted despite death, that hope was justified even in the darkest times, and that the skills and knowledge of traditional healers remained valuable even when confronted by new and devastating challenges. The broader implications of surviving plague during childbirth would continue to influence Margaret, Eleanor, and their family for years to come, creating bonds of survival and shared experience that went far beyond normal family relationships. Lumen Margaret's recovery from both plague and childbirth had left her with a profound appreciation for life's fragility and preciousness that would shape her approach to motherhood and her relationships within the community. Eleanor would grow up knowing that she had survived extraordinary circumstances from birth, a knowledge that would influence her understanding of her own strength and resilience throughout her life. For the community of Thornfield, the story of Eleanor's birth became part of the collective memory of how they had survived the plague years, serving as evidence that even the most devastating epidemics could not completely destroy the fundamental processes of human life and community. Continuity. Historic Agnes's role in preserving both mother and child had established her not just as a skilled healer, but as a symbol of the community's ability to adapt, survive, and continue creating new life, even in the face of mass death and social disruption. The medical knowledge that Agnes had developed during Margaret's case would influence her practice for the remainder of her career, as she continued to encounter situations where traditional approaches needed to be modified or abandoned, entirely in response to extraordinary circumstances. University of Shea had learned that effective healing required not just technical skill, but also emotional courage, creative problem-solving, and the ability to maintain hope and determination when conventional wisdom proved inadequate. These lessons would serve her well as she continued to practice midwifery and general healing in a world that had been permanently changed by the experience of plague and the social transformations that followed in its wake. The morning of September 15, 1348, dawned clear and cold in the village of Thornwick, bringing with it the kind of crystalline autumn air that should have promised a day of productive harvest work and the quiet satisfaction of another successful growing season. Historic instead, it brought Thomas Whitmore, the village reeve, to a decision that would transform Thornwick from an ordinary farming community into a symbol of sacrifice that would be remembered long after the Black Death had run its course. Through medieval England, standing in the doorway of his cottage, looking out over the fields where his neighbors should have been gathering the last of the barley harvest, Thomas could see the telltale signs that the pestilence had finally reached their isolated corner of Derbyshire. You must understand that Thornwick was not a place that attracted attention or visitors under normal circumstances. Nestled in a valley between two hills, the village consisted of perhaps 40 families who lived in the kind of subsistence-based agricultural community that had sustained itself for generations through careful management of limited resources and the deep social bonds that developed among people who depended entirely on each other for survival. The villagers grew barley and oats, raised sheep and cattle, and produced just enough surplus to meet their obligations to the lord of the manor while maintaining stores, sufficient to carry them through the lean months of winter. In early spring, the isolation that had protected Thornwick from many of the disruptions that affected larger, more connected communities had also delayed the arrival of the plague that was devastating England during the autumn of 1348. Historic, while cities like London and Bristol had been struggling with massive mortality rates since midsummer, and market towns throughout the country had seen their populations decimated by the disease, Thornwick had remained untouched by the pestilence that was reshaping medieval society. The villagers had heard stories of the devastating illness from traveling merchants and tinkers, but these reports had seemed like tales from another world, too terrible and remote to affect their own quiet existence. The first sign of plague in Thornwick appeared in the cottage of Henry the Miller, whose family had operated the village's grain mill for 3 generations and whose position required him to have more contact with outsiders than most of the other residents. Storic Henry's youngest son, a boy of 8 named Peter, had developed a fever during the night, followed quickly by the characteristic swellings in his neck and armpits that marked the bubonic form of plague. By morning, 2 other children in the Miller's family were showing similar symptoms, and Henry himself had begun to complain of the severe headache and weakness that typically preceded the development of more serious manifestations of the disease. Thomas Whitmore's role as village reeve made him responsible for maintaining order and coordinating community responses to various challenges. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for the crisis that plague would bring to Thornwick. The position of reeve was both an honor and a burden in medieval village life, requiring someone with the respect of his neighbors and the practical skills needed to organize collective work projects, mediate disputes, and serve as the interface between the village and the outside world. Thomas had held the position for 7 years, earning trust through his fair dealing and his ability to balance competing interests for the common good of the community. But the arrival of plague in Thornwick presented challenges that exceeded the normal scope of village governance and required decisions that would test every assumption about community, responsibility, and individual rights that had guided medieval rural life. Historic Thomas understood from the reports that had reached them from other regions that plague spread rapidly through communities, typically killing between 30% and 60% of the population before running its course. He also knew that the movement of infected people from village to village was one of the primary mechanisms by which the disease spread across the countryside, carrying death to communities that might otherwise have remained safe. The geographic situation of Thornwick, while it had delayed the arrival of plague, also created unique opportunities for containing its spread if the villagers were willing to make the ultimate sacrifice. Historic, the village was connected to the outside world by a single narrow road that wound through the Azore Hills, and its nearest neighbors were scattered farmsteads and small hamlets that lay several miles away across difficult terrain. If the people of Thornwick could prevent anyone from leaving their community once plague had appeared, they might be able to contain the infection and prevent it from spreading to dozens of other communities throughout the region. The moral and practical implications of such a decision were staggering. Historic self-imposed quarantine would mean condemning every person in Thornwick to face the plague without hope of escape, medical assistance from outside healers, or spiritual comfort from clergy who were not already trapped within the village boundaries. It would require the villagers to watch their friends and family members die while knowing that they could not seek help from the outside world or flee to safety themselves. Most difficult of all, it would require them to accept that their own deaths were likely, and that their sacrifice might benefit people they had never met in communities they would never see. Thomas spent the morning of September 15th walking through Thornwick, talking with the heads of households and gauging their understanding of the crisis that was beginning to unfold in their community. The Miller's family was clearly in the early stages of plague infection, but no other households had yet reported symptoms among their members. This created a narrow window of time during which the villagers still make a choice about how to respond to the presence of disease in their community. Once plague began to spread more widely, panic and desperation would make rational decision-making far more difficult, and the opportunity for coordinated community action would likely be lost. The conversations that Thomas had with his neighbors revealed the complex mixture of fear, resignation, and stubborn determination that characterized the medieval peasants' response to crisis. Historic, most of the villagers understood that plague was often fatal, and they had few illusions about their chances of survival if the disease spread throughout Thornwick. But they also understood that their village was part of a larger network of communities connected by kinship ties, economic relationships, and shared responsibilities that extended far beyond their own immediate interests. The decision of whether to quarantine themselves was not just about their own survival, but about their obligations to friends and relatives in neighboring villages who might be spared if Thornwick could contain its infection. The spiritual dimensions of the decision were equally complex, touching on fundamental questions about divine will, human responsibility, and the nature of Christian duty that had no clear answers in medieval theology. Historic Father Benedict, the elderly priest who served Thornwick and 3 neighboring parishes, had been present in the village when the plague symptoms appeared, and he found himself trapped by the same quarantine decision that faced all the other residents. His guidance would be crucial to the community's deliberations, but he too was struggling with questions that had no precedent in his theological training or pastoral experience. The practical challenges of implementing a quarantine were as daunting as the moral questions it raised. Thornwick would need to become entirely self-sufficient for an indefinite period, relying on its own resources for food, fuel, medical care, and all the other necessities of life. The village's harvest was nearly complete, and their stores of grain and preserved foods might be adequate to sustain the population through the winter months, but there would be no opportunity to trade surplus production for goods they could not produce themselves. More critically, they would need to care for plague victims using only the medical knowledge and herbal remedies available within their own community, without access to physicians, surgeons, or the more sophisticated treatments that might be available in larger towns. The question of enforcement also presented significant challenges. Historic, a voluntary quarantine would only be effective if every member of the community agreed to abide by its restrictions. And the temptation to flee would become stronger as the death toll mounted and desperation increased. The village would need to establish some mechanism for preventing people from leaving, but this would require them to essentially imprison themselves and their neighbors in a community where death rates might reach catastrophic levels. The psychological strain of such confinement, combined with The trauma of watching plague claim their friends and family members would test the social bonds that held the community together. As afternoon turned to evening, and Thomas prepared to call a village meeting that would determine Thornwick's response to the plague crisis, he found himself thinking about the kind of community that could voluntarily choose to sacrifice itself for the welfare of strangers. Historic, the decision they were contemplating required a level of social cohesion and shared purpose that went far beyond the normal expectations of medieval village life. It demanded that individual survival instincts be subordinated to collective responsibility, that immediate self-interest be sacrificed for abstract moral principles, and that the natural human desire to preserve one's own life and family be overcome by concern for the welfare of Craktea. Only Ruby Kiss has the luxurious texture that Tuktia, that glides on Smalv, and leaves a rich, long-lasting meat unwazed place. Me, a cly, my clav. Me, I can read by me with kide. Lead ad. But I send you sa you'd we sad it. I sag I kai kapusip sa so distant communities. The meeting that convened in Thornwick's small church as the sun set on September 15th would be remembered as one of the most extraordinary gatherings in the history of medieval England. Historic 43 adults crowded into the simple stone building that had served their community for generations, representing every family in the village and carrying with them the weight of a decision that would determine not just their own fates, but the welfare of countless people throughout the region. The flickering candlelight that illuminated their faces as they debated the quarantine proposal would be the last time that the people of Thornwick would gather as a complete community, free to choose their own destiny and hopeful about their future survival. The discussion that followed would test every assumption about human nature, community, responsibility, and the value of individual life that had guided medieval society. Historic, over the course of 3 hours, the villagers debated the moral, practical, and spiritual implications of voluntary quarantine with a sophistication and depth that would have impressed the learned scholars of Oxford or Paris. They considered their obligations to their children, their duty to their neighbors, their responsibility to God, and their role in the larger human community with a seriousness and thoughtfulness that revealed the complexity of medieval peasant society and the depths of moral reasoning that could exist in even the most isolated rural communities. When the final vote was taken just before midnight, the decision was unanimous. Historic, every adult in Thornwick had agreed to remain in the village regardless of how the plague crisis developed, accepting the likelihood of their own deaths in order to prevent the spread of infection to neighboring communities. They had chosen to transform their village from a place of life and hope into what they understood would likely become a place of death and sacrifice. Making this choice not from despair or resignation, but from a calculated moral decision about their responsibilities to others and their role in preserving the welfare of the larger human community. The implementation of Thornwick's quarantine began at dawn on September 16th, with a series of practical measures that would transform the village from an open agricultural community into a closed fortress where 43 families had voluntarily imprisoned themselves with death. Historic Thomas Whitmore organized work parties to construct barriers across the single road that connected the village to the outside world, using fallen trees, stone walls, and wooden fences to create obstacles that would discourage casual travelers, while serving as a constant reminder to the villagers themselves of their commitment to remaining within the community boundaries regardless of how desperate their situation might become. The psychological impact of these barriers was immediate and profound, creating a physical manifestation of the choice that the villagers had made and eliminating the possibility of impulsive flight that might undermine their collective resolve. Children who had previously wandered freely through the surrounding hills and fields now found their movement restricted to the village proper, while adults who had regularly traveled to market towns or visited relatives in neighboring communities faced the reality that they might never see the outside world again. The barriers served not just as physical obstacles, but as constant reminders of the magnitude of the sacrifice that every person in Thornwick had agreed to make. The early days of the quarantine were marked by a feverish effort to organize the village's resources and prepare for the siege-like conditions that would characterize their isolation. Historic food stores were inventoried and rationed, with careful attention to ensuring that supplies would last through the winter months and into the following spring, if necessary. Medical supplies were gathered from every household and placed under the care of Martha, the wise woman, whose knowledge of herbal remedies would be crucial to treating plague victims. Without access to outside physicians or clergy trained in healing arts, the social reorganization required by quarantine conditions created new patterns of cooperation and mutual dependence that tested the traditional structures of medieval village life. Families that had previously operated as independent economic units found themselves sharing resources and labor in ways that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. The barriers that had once existed between households, economic competition, social hierarchy, personal grudges began to dissolve under the pressure of shared danger and mutual dependence that characterized their voluntary imprisonment. The progression of plague through Henry the Miller's family provided a grim preview of what the entire village could expect as the disease spread through their community. Historic young Peter, the first to show symptoms, died on the third day of the quarantine. His small body overwhelmed by the combination of fever, respiratory distress, and the massive swellings that had developed in his lymph nodes. His death was followed within hours by that of his sister Mary, and by the end of the first week, Henry himself had succumbed to the infection, leaving only his wife Sarah and their eldest son to carry on the essential work of operating the village mill. The challenge of caring for plague victims within the constraints of quarantine revealed both the limitations and the strengths of medieval village communities. University of Martha's herbal remedies could provide some comfort to the suffering and might occasionally slow the progression of symptoms, but they were essentially powerless against the bacterial infection that was destroying the victims' bodies from within. The village's collective response to this medical helplessness was to focus on providing comfort, dignity, and spiritual support to those who were dying, transforming the process of death from a medical failure into a community ritual that honored both the suffering of the victims and the sacrifice they were making. The spiritual dimensions of the quarantine were complicated by Father Benedict's presence within the village boundaries. It created both opportunities and challenges for maintaining the religious practices that gave meaning to medieval life. Historic. On one hand, the availability of a priest within the quarantined community meant that the dying could receive last rites and that religious services could continue despite their isolation from the outside world. On the other hand, Father Benedict's own vulnerability to plague infection meant that the spiritual leadership of the community might be lost just when it was needed most desperately. The economic challenges of maintaining village life under quarantine conditions required constant adaptation and innovation as traditional patterns of production and exchange became impossible. The miller's death had eliminated one of the village's essential services, forcing the community to develop alternative methods for processing grain that required more labor but could be managed by people without specialized training. Similar adaptations were needed in other areas of production as illness and death claimed villagers whose skills and knowledge had been crucial to the communities. Economic functioning, the psychological strain of quarantine life was perhaps the most difficult challenge that the villagers faced, as the combination of isolation, fear, and constant exposure to death tested their mental health and social cohesion in ways that no previous crisis had prepared them for. Historic, the knowledge that they had voluntarily chosen their imprisonment provided some comfort, but it could not eliminate the natural human desire to flee from danger or the growing despair. that accompanied each new death in their community. The village developed informal support systems and coping mechanisms. But these were constantly strained by the relentless pressure of their circumstances. As October progressed and the plague continued to spread through Thornwick's population, the village began to take on the characteristics of a community under siege. With all the psychological and social disruptions that such conditions created, historic families barricaded themselves within their cottages when illness appeared, creating smaller quarantines within the larger isolation of the village. Children who survived the deaths of their parents were taken in by neighboring families, creating new kinship bonds based on necessity rather than blood relationships. The normal rhythms of work and social interaction were disrupted by the constant presence of death and the need to care for the sick and dying. The question of whether their sacrifice was serving its intended purpose became a source of both comfort and anxiety as the villagers struggled to maintain their resolve in the face of mounting casualties. Historic, they had no way of knowing whether neighboring communities remained free of plague infection or whether their quarantine was successfully preventing the spread of disease to other regions. The isolation that made their sacrifice possible also cut them off from information about its effectiveness, leaving them to maintain their commitment based on faith rather than evidence that their suffering was achieving its intended goals. The practical challenges of disposing of plague victims within a quarantined community created health hazards that complicated their efforts to prevent the further spread of disease. Historic, the village churchyard, which would normally have been adequate for their burial needs, became overcrowded as death rates climbed beyond anything the community had previously experienced. The villagers were forced to dig mass graves and develop new burial procedures that balanced their desire to honor the dead with the practical necessities of public health and disease prevention. The leadership structure of the village adapted to quarantine conditions in ways that reflected both the democratic traditions of medieval rural communities and the extraordinary circumstances they faced. Thomas Whitmore's role as Reeve expanded to encompass responsibilities that went far beyond normal village governance. But he shared decision-making authority with a council that included Father Benedict, Martha the Wise Woman, and the heads of the surviving households. This collective leadership provided stability and legitimacy for the difficult decisions that quarantine life required, while ensuring that the community's democratic values were maintained even under extreme circumstances. The adaptation of children to quarantine life revealed both their resilience and their vulnerability in the face of circumstances that challenged every assumption about normal childhood development. Lumen young people who had never traveled beyond the village boundaries found their world contracted even further, but they also discovered new responsibilities and opportunities, as the deaths of adults created gaps in the community's labor force that needed to be filled. The process of growing up in a quarantined plague village created a generation of survivors who would carry with them unique perspectives on community, sacrifice, and the meaning of social responsibility. As November arrived and the first snows began to fall in the hills around Thornwick, the village had already lost more than half of its original population to plague, but the survivors continued to maintain their commitment to the quarantine that had transformed their community from a place of life into a monument to human sacrifice. Historic, the approaching winter brought new challenges as reduced numbers of healthy workers made it more difficult to maintain essential services and gather the fuel needed to keep their homes warm during the cold months ahead. But it also brought the hope that plague might run its course before claiming all of the remaining villagers, leaving some survivors to carry the story of Thornwick's sacrifice to the outside world. The winter of 1348-1349 transformed Thornwick into a place that existed at the intersection of the living and the dead, where the handful of plague survivors moved through a landscape dominated by empty cottages and silent workshops that had once buzzed with the productive activity of a thriving agricultural community. Historic, by December, the village's population had been reduced from 43 families to fewer than 20 individuals, most of them children and elderly people whose survival seemed to represent some inexplicable quirk of fate, rather than any natural resistance to the disease that had claimed so many of their neighbors and relatives. Thomas Whitmore had survived the plague, though he had lost his wife and 2 of his 3 children, leaving him to care for his youngest daughter Sarah, while simultaneously trying to maintain some semblance of village governance in a community that had been devastated beyond recognition. His role as Reeve had evolved into something closer to the leader of a refugee camp, coordinating the efforts of the survivors to maintain basic services and prepare for a winter that would test their reduced community's ability to sustain itself under conditions that would have been challenging even for a village at full strength. The practical challenges of winter survival with such a reduced population forced the survivors to abandon many of the assumptions about self-sufficiency and individual responsibility that had governed medieval village life. Historic cottages that had previously housed separate families were consolidated to conserve fuel for heating, creating communal living arrangements that maximized the survivors' ability to share resources and provide mutual support. The remaining livestock were gathered into central locations, where they could be cared for more efficiently by the reduced number of healthy adults. And food stores were pooled and rationed according to collective rather than individual ownership principles. Martha the Wise Woman had emerged as one of the most important figures in the surviving community, not just because of her medical knowledge, but because of her role in maintaining the work's spiritual and emotional resilience that kept the survivors functioning despite their devastating losses. University of Father Benedict had died in November, one of the last victims of the plague's passage, through Thornwick, leaving Martha to provide both medical care and spiritual comfort to a community that had been stripped of most of its traditional sources of authority and guidance. Her survival had given the village access to herbal knowledge and healing practices that would be crucial during the difficult months of recovery that lay ahead. The question of what would happen to Thornwick after the plague had run its course began to occupy the thoughts of the survivors as they struggled to maintain their community through the winter months. Historic, the village's infrastructure, its mill, its church, its fields and workshops remained largely intact, but the human knowledge and social relationships that had made them functional had been largely destroyed. The survivors faced the challenge of rebuilding not just their economic productivity, but their entire social structure, creating new patterns of cooperation and authority that could sustain a community with a dramatically reduced population and a traumatic shared history. The psychological impact of survival in a community where the majority of residents had died created mental health challenges that had no precedent in medieval experience or understanding. Historic, the survivors struggled with what modern psychology would recognize as survivor's guilt, wondering why they had been spared when so many others had died, and questioning whether their survival was a blessing or a burden. The constant presence of death and loss had created a kind of emotional numbness that protected them from being overwhelmed by grief, but also made it difficult to experience joy or hope about the future. The children who had survived the plague faced particularly complex challenges as they tried to adapt to a world where most of the adults they had known and depended on were no longer present. Looming young people who should have been learning trades from their fathers or domestic skills from their mothers instead found themselves caring for younger siblings and taking on adult responsibilities years before they would normally have been expected to do so. The loss of so many parents and teachers meant that much of the practical knowledge that sustained village life was at risk of being lost entirely unless the survivors could find ways to preserve and transmit what they remembered. The economic viability of Thornwick as an ongoing community became increasingly questionable as the winter progressed, and the survivors confronted the reality of trying to maintain agricultural production with such a reduced population. The village's fields would require planting and cultivation in the spring, but there might not be enough healthy adults to perform the necessary work. The mill that had served as the economic foundation of the community would need to be operated by someone with the technical knowledge to maintain its machinery and the business skills to manage its relationships with customers from neighboring villages. The question of whether to maintain the quarantine or to reopen contact with the outside world created new dilemmas for the survivors as spring approached and the immediate threat of plague infection began to recede. Historic, their original commitment had been to prevent the spread of plague to neighboring communities, but with no new cases appearing in Thornwick for several months, the rationale for continued isolation became less clear. The survivors faced the challenge of determining when their sacrifice had achieved its purpose and when they could safely reintegrate themselves into the larger world without violating the moral principles that had guided their decision. The process of emerging from quarantine proved to be almost as difficult as the decision to impose it had been, requiring the survivors to navigate complex questions about their obligations to the dead, their responsibilities to the living, and their role in a world that had been fundamentally changed by the plague experience. Historic Thomas Whitmore, as the senior surviving member of the community, found himself responsible for making contact with the outside world and determining whether it was safe to resume normal relationships with neighboring villages. The first tentative contacts revealed that Thornwick's sacrifice had indeed been successful. The plague had not spread to nearby communities, and their quarantine had prevented the deaths of hundreds of people throughout the region. The recognition that their sacrifice had served its intended purpose provided some comfort to the survivors, but it also created new burdens as they struggled to rebuild their lives, while carrying the knowledge that their community had voluntarily chosen death to save others. Historic, the story of Thornwick's quarantine began to spread throughout England, creating a legend of selfless sacrifice that would inspire other communities facing similar crises. But for the survivors themselves, the attention and praise that their story attracted was often more difficult to bear than the isolation and hardship they had endured during the plague months. The long-term consequences of Thornwick's experience extended far beyond the immediate impact of population loss and economic disruption to encompass fundamental changes in the survivors' understanding of community, mortality, and human responsibility. Historic, the children who had grown up during the quarantine carried with them a unique perspective on the relationship between individual survival and collective welfare that would influence their decisions throughout their lives. The adults who had lived through the crisis found that their priorities and values had been permanently altered by their experience of voluntary sacrifice and community. Solidarity in the face of death. Martha, the wise woman, as one of the few surviving adults with specialized knowledge and skills, became a central figure in the village's reconstruction efforts and a repository of the medical and practical wisdom that had sustained the community through its darkest period. University of her role expanded beyond traditional healing to encompass teaching younger survivors the skills they would need to maintain the village's economic and social functions. She also served as the keeper of Thornwick's story, ensuring that the memory of their sacrifice would be preserved and transmitted to future generations who might face similar moral challenges. The physical reconstruction of Thornwick required not only the repair of buildings and infrastructure that had been neglected during the plague months, but also the creation of new economic and social institutions that could function with a dramatically reduced population. The survivors experimented with collective ownership and management of resources that had previously been controlled by individual families, creating cooperative arrangements that maximized their efficiency, while preserving the democratic traditions that had enabled their community to make such an extraordinary collective decision. The arrival of new settlers who were attracted by the availability of land and the reputation of Thornwick's inhabitants created both opportunities and challenges for the surviving community. Historic, the newcomers brought needed skills and labor that were essential for the village's economic recovery. But they also introduced social dynamics that sometimes conflicted with the close-knit relationships and shared values that had developed. Among the plague survivors, the process of integrating new residents while preserving the special character that had made Thornwick's sacrifice possible required careful navigation of competing interests and expectations. The spiritual legacy of Thornwick's experience influenced the religious life of the reconstructed community in ways that reflected both the trauma of their losses and the meaning they had found in their sacrifice. Historic, the village church, which had been the site of their momentous decision to quarantine themselves, became a place of pilgrimage for people seeking inspiration and guidance in their own struggles with moral challenges. The survivors developed new religious practices and observances that honored their dead while celebrating the values of community, solidarity, and selfless service that had made their sacrifice possible. As the years passed and Thornwick gradually returned to prosperity, the story of the village's quarantine became part of the collective memory of medieval England, serving as a reminder that even in the darkest times, human communities could rise above self-interest to serve larger moral purposes. Historic, the example of Thornwick inspired other communities to consider their own responsibilities to the common good and demonstrated that ordinary people could make extraordinary sacrifices when guided by clear moral principles and strong social bonds the survivors of Thornwick carried with them. Throughout their lives, the knowledge that they had participated in something unprecedented in human history, a community's voluntary decision to face death rather than risk spreading suffering to others. Historic, this knowledge shaped their understanding of their own mortality and their responsibilities to future generations, creating a legacy of service and sacrifice that would influence their descendants for centuries to come. The children who had grown up during the quarantine became adults who understood instinctively that individual welfare was inseparable from community welfare, and that the preservation of human life sometimes required the willingness to risk one's own. Thomas Whitmore lived to see Thornwick's population recover and the village return to prosperity. But he never forgot the weight of the decision that had transformed his community from an ordinary farming village into a symbol of human moral courage. In his final years, he often reflected on the question of whether their sacrifice had been worth the cost, and he always concluded that the opportunity to save hundreds of lives had justified the deaths of his neighbors and family members. His conviction that their community had made the right choice provided a foundation for the values and traditions that would guide Thornwick's inhabitants long after the plague years had become a distant memory. The story of Thornwick's quarantine became a testament to the capacity of human communities to transcend the natural instinct for self-preservation when faced with moral challenges that required extraordinary sacrifice. Historic, their decision demonstrated that medieval peasants, despite their reputation for ignorance and superstition, were capable of sophisticated moral reasoning and collective action that could serve purposes far beyond their own immediate interests. The village that chose death had ultimately chosen life not for themselves, but for the countless strangers whose survival was made possible by their sacrifice. The legacy of Thornwick's quarantine would endure long after the Black Death had run its course through medieval Europe, serving as a reminder that the most profound human achievements often arise not from individual heroism, but from the willingness of ordinary people to work together in service of principles that transcend their own personal welfare. Historic, the village that had voluntarily transformed itself into a place of death had created something far more enduring, a story of moral courage that would inspire and guide human communities, facing their own moments of crisis and choice for generations to come. And so ends our journey through the profound boredom and extraordinary significance of being sick in a medieval village. Historic, from Margot's endless winter nights, grinding herbs by candlelight, to the carpenter family's careful mathematics of survival, from Annis's lonely vigil in the birthing chamber to Thornwick's ultimate sacrifice. We have witnessed the quiet heroism of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances with nothing but their accumulated wisdom their stubborn determination, and their deep commitment to the welfare of their communities. These stories remind us that the history of distorted medicine is not just the history of great discoveries and famous physicians, but the history of countless unnamed individuals who cared for the sick, comforted the dying, and preserved the knowledge that allowed human communities to endure through the darkest periods of pestilence and famine. University of the wise women and village healers, the desperate parents and devoted spouses. The midwives and community leaders who appear in these tales represent the vast majority of medical practitioners throughout human history. People whose work was guided not by formal education or professional credentials, but by experience, compassion, and the simple recognition that suffering neighbors required whatever help could be provided. The medieval understanding of illness and healing, with its emphasis on humoral balance, spiritual influences, and herbal remedies, may seem primitive by modern standards, but it represented humanity's best efforts to comprehend and respond to forces that were largely beyond their control or understanding. Historic, the remedies they employed often provided real comfort and sometimes genuine healing, but perhaps more importantly, they offered hope and human connection to people facing the ultimate uncertainties of life and death. In a world where scientific medicine was still centuries away, the act of caring itself became a form of treatment that addressed the emotional and spiritual dimensions of illness, even when physical cures were impossible. The social dimensions of medieval illness reveal how deeply interconnected individual health and community welfare truly were in these small, isolated communities. When someone fell ill in a medieval village, their condition affected not just their immediate family, but the entire network of relationships and dependencies that sustained the community's economic and social functioning. The loss of a skilled craftsman, the illness of a key agricultural worker, or the death of a woman of childbearing age created ripple effects that could be felt throughout the village for years to come. Perhaps most remarkably, these stories demonstrate the extraordinary moral courage that ordinary people were capable of when faced with choices that pitted individual survival against collective welfare. Historic, the villagers of Thornwick. The members of the carpenter family sharing their last resources. Agnes risking her own life to deliver Margaret's baby. Margot continuing her rounds despite her own doubts and fears. All of these examples remind us that the capacity for selfless service and moral heroism was not limited to saints and nobles, but could be found among the humblest members of medieval society. The legacy of these forgotten struggles continues to influence our modern understanding of healthcare, community responsibility, and the relationship between individual welfare and collective survival. Historic, the questions that medieval villagers faced about how to care for the sick, how to allocate scarce resources during times of crisis, and how to balance individual rights against community needs remain relevant today. Even as our technical capabilities have advanced far beyond anything that Margot or Agnes could have imagined,